The judge asked my sister and her ex to explain where each daughter would live if the court changed their custody schedule. Scott pointed toward Kara's wheelchair without looking at her. I can't build my new life around that level of care. I waited for Monica to tear him apart. Instead, she said, "Neither can I." Kara's fingers tightened around the armrest. "Auntie, where am I supposed to go?" Before I could answer, 12-year-old Lucy stood beside her lawyer. "They already made us choose. We said we wouldn't split up. Then they chose for us." She looked at her parents. "They both picked me. Nobody picked her." The courtroom went silent. I stood. "Your Honor, please don't separate them. Before I tell you what happened after that, I hope you'll stay with me until the end, because what happened in that courtroom was only the first truth to come out. And if stories about family, hard choices, and the people who finally decide to stand up matter to you, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and stay with us." By the time I stood that morning, Kara had been sleeping at my house for almost 3 weeks. Nobody had called it moving in. Monica had called the first night an emergency. Scott had called the second one a scheduling problem. By the fourth night, Kara had a phone charger plugged permanently into the outlet beside my couch. By the end of the first week, Lucy had started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom because there were evenings when she followed her sister over after one parent or the other failed to settle who was supposed to have them. I had told myself it was temporary because that was the word everybody kept using. Temporary was easier to live with. Temporary meant I did not have to admit that my 56-year-old life had begun changing before anyone asked my permission. It meant the folded wheelchair cushion drying beside my kitchen sink was only there for a few days. It meant the stack of school papers on my dining table did not belong there. It meant I could keep believing Monica and Scott would eventually stop using their divorce like a rope in a tug-of-war, and remember there were 2 girls tied to the middle of it. They had been separated since January of the previous year. The divorce itself had been final since November. I remembered Monica calling me the evening the judgment came through and saying, with exhausted relief, that at least the legal part was over. It had not been over. The marriage had ended. The fighting had simply found new subjects. At first, the custody schedule looked reasonable on paper. Both girls moved between Monica's place and Scott's. Both parents kept legal responsibility. They divided school weeks, weekends, holidays, medical appointments, and all the other pieces adults put into boxes when a family no longer fits under one roof. But Kara did not fit neatly into boxes. She had been 9 when a car crash injured her spinal cord. 6 years later, her wheelchair was not a tragedy sitting in the middle of every room. It was how she moved through the world. She could transfer herself most of the time. She went to school, drew constantly, complained about homework, rolled her eyes when adults hovered, and could turn sarcasm into a precision instrument when she thought someone was pitying her. What she needed was not somebody standing over her every minute. She needed people to plan. A car she could transfer into. A chair that could be loaded. A bathroom she could use safely. A front entrance without someone saying, after arriving, that they had forgotten about the steps. A ride that showed up when it was supposed to. Parents willing to accept that spontaneity sometimes required 15 minutes of thought over the months after the divorce. Those 15 minutes seemed to become more than either Monica or Scott wanted to give. I saw pieces of it without understanding the pattern. Monica would ask me to pick Kara up because Scott was stuck at work. Scott would ask whether Kara could stay the night because Monica had changed a plan. There were times I drove across town thinking I was helping one parent through an unusually bad afternoon, only to discover later that the other parent had also been available, but had assumed someone else would handle it. I did what I had always done in our family. I helped. I did not ask too many questions. I told myself their divorce was none of my business. That morning in August, sitting behind Monica and Scott in a cool courtroom while Sacramento baked outside, I still believed there had to be some limit to how far they would take it. The hearing had been scheduled because both of them wanted the existing custody arrangement changed. By then, they were each building a new life. Monica was engaged to Ethan, a widower with a teenage son. Scott was seeing Dana and had moved into a place that, according to him, suited his work and the life he wanted after years of marital unhappiness. Both filings spent a remarkable amount of energy explaining why Lucy should live primarily with them. Monica emphasized school continuity, neighborhood friends, and her future household. Scott emphasized flexibility, activities, and the amount of time he believed he could give Lucy. Kara's name appeared too, but differently. Her needs, her transportation, her routines, her accessibility. Reading the papers before the hearing, I had felt something wrong without being able to put my finger on it. Lucy was described as a daughter. Kara was described as a management problem. Still, I had assumed the judge would force them to produce a real arrangement for both girls. That was exactly what happened. The judge had listened to both attorneys summarize the competing requests, then cut through pages of polished language with a simple question. If the current schedule changed, where exactly did each parent propose that each daughter live? Scott shifted in his chair. I watched the back of his neck redden above his collar. He explained that his work sometimes required travel, that his rental had steps, that his schedule was less predictable than Monica's, and that Kara's transportation and accessibility needs made full-time responsibility difficult. He could have stopped there. Instead, he gestured toward Kara's chair without looking at her. I can't build my new life around that level of care. For 1 second, all I could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Kara's hands were resting on the black rims of her wheels. Her right thumb began rubbing the same small spot along the metal, back and forth, back and forth. She did that when she wanted nobody to know something had hurt. I looked at Monica. Whatever problems my sister and I had, I thought I knew what would happen next. I expected her to turn toward Scott with the fury of a mother who had just heard the father of her child reduce that child to an inconvenience. Monica's shoulders barely moved. She told the judge Kara needed stability, consistency, and a household properly prepared for her needs. Her words were smoother than Scott's, kinder on the surface. She spoke about what would be best for Kara, rather than what Monica herself wanted. Then she said she could not take Kara full-time either. Neither can I. Kara stopped rubbing the wheel. She stared at the floor for several seconds. The polished wood beneath her chair reflected the dark outline of the tires and the toe of Lucy's sneaker beside her. Then she leaned toward me. "Auntie, where am I supposed to go?" There are moments when your body reacts before your mind catches up. My chair scraped softly behind me because I had started to move without knowing whether I meant to kneel beside her, touch her shoulder, or stand up and shout at two people I had spent years trying not to judge. I did none of those things. Lucy moved first. Her lawyer, Priya Shah, was sitting close enough to put a hand lightly near Lucy's arm without grabbing her. Before the hearing, Priya had already told the judge that Lucy wanted to speak directly. The judge had considered the request ahead of time and made clear that Lucy would be allowed a short statement, with the adults kept from turning it into an interrogation. Until that moment, I had assumed Lucy wanted to tell the judge which parent she preferred. I could not have been more wrong. She stood beside Priya, small enough that the conference table seemed too large in front of her. Lucy had spent most of the summer making herself easy to overlook. She said she was fine when she was not. Ate whatever was put in front of her, changed her answer if she sensed an adult disliked the first one. I had mistaken some of it for maturity. Now she twisted one finger into the hem of her shirt and looked toward the bench instead of at either parent. They already made us choose. We said we wouldn't split up. Then they chose for us. Her voice was not dramatic. That made it worse. She explained in the simple, uneven way children explain something they have been carrying too long. Monica and Scott had told the girls there might be one child in each house. They had asked who wanted to go with whom. Kara had refused to choose if choosing meant losing Lucy. Lucy had refused too. After that, something changed. Monica started talking to Lucy about the room she could have in her new family. Scott started telling Lucy about weekends and plans they could make together. Lucy said neither of them talked to Kara that way. She finally looked at her parents. They both picked me. Nobody picked her. Monica's face went pale. Scott looked down at the table. Kara did not look at either of them. That was the moment I stood. I had no plan. I had no ramp at my front door. My bathroom was barely wide enough for Kara to turn comfortably with the cabinet door open. My work schedule had been built around one person. My savings account was respectable only if nobody suddenly needed lawyers, home modifications, 2 teenagers, transportation changes, school supplies, and whatever else I had not thought of yet. All of that flashed through me in fragments. But there was one thing I knew, before I knew anything else. I would not watch those girls be divided because the adults responsible for them had decided one child was easier to fit into a second life. Your Honor, please don't separate them. The judge did not turn my sentence into an instant custody ruling. He asked the practical questions that came next, and I explained that Kara had already been staying with me for most of the previous 3 weeks, with Lucy there several nights as well. My house was safe, but not fully adapted, and I was willing to have both girls stay with me temporarily, while the court determined what happened next. I was not pretending to be ready for permanent custody. I was barely prepared for dinner. Permanent decisions would require a proper process, and the girls' attorneys would remain involved. If I intended to seek legal custody as a non-parent, I would have to enter the case properly. Monica and Scott could have objected even to the temporary arrangement. Neither did. After brief exchanges among the attorneys, both agreed on the record that Kara and Lucy could remain with me while the matter was continued. It was the first thing they had agreed on all morning. Their daughters could go home with somebody else. Outside the courtroom, the August heat hit us like an oven door opening. The courthouse steps shimmered under the sun, and Kara squinted as Lucy pushed her own hair away from her face. Monica caught up with me before we reached the shaded part of the walkway. She did not apologize to Kara. She did not ask Lucy why she had been scared enough to tell the judge what had happened. Instead, she told me I had made one ugly hearing sound like an abandonment. She said people would misunderstand what she meant, that she had been trying to be realistic about Kara's needs, and that I knew perfectly well how exhausting the years after Kara's accident had been. Scott took a different route. He said I had volunteered to help and warned me not to turn a temporary arrangement into a custody grab. There might have been a time when I would have answered both of them, explained myself, calmed Monica down, assured Scott that nobody was trying to steal his children, found some careful sentence that allowed everyone to leave, believing we were still a family having a disagreement. Instead, I watched them. Monica kept talking about what people might think. Scott kept talking about what I might try to take. Neither one talked about the fact that Kara had sat 3 feet away, while both parents explained why they could not fit her into their lives. I helped Kara into my car. Lucy climbed into the back and shut the door harder than usual. For the first time in my life, I left my sister standing on a sidewalk while she was still talking to me. The drive home took less than half an hour. Nobody said much. Lucy rested her forehead against the window. Kara watched the city slide past and kept one hand over the strap securing her folded chair. At a red light, I caught her reflection in the rear-view mirror. Her face looked composed. Too composed. I wanted to tell her she was safe with me. The words stayed in my mouth. She had heard adults make promises before. Another promise from another adult was probably the cheapest thing I could offer her, so I drove. My house had never looked particularly small to me until I pulled into the driveway with 2 girls whose lives now had to fit inside it. The 2 shallow steps at the front entrance might as well have been a wall. For the last few weeks, we had been using the side entrance because it had a lower threshold with a temporary piece of plywood I hated every time Kara rolled over it. That afternoon, I saw every flaw at once. The narrow bathroom doorway, the rugs I had already moved twice, the kitchen table positioned where Kara had to angle around it, the stack of her belongings still sitting in reusable grocery bags because nobody had wanted to call them luggage. Calling something temporary had become its own kind of avoidance. Lucy carried her backpack inside. Kara transferred from the car while I unloaded her chair. I had done it enough times by then to know when to help and when to stay out of the way, though stress made me hover. Inside, I pulled a measuring tape from the junk drawer, then another from the garage, because I did not trust the first one. I put a legal pad on the kitchen counter, printed accessibility notes I had saved earlier in the week, and started writing down measurements for the bathroom entrance. Kara watched me gather my supplies. Her mouth twitched. "Aunt Elaine, I need a bathroom. You appear to be planning a moon landing." Lucy made a sound halfway between a laugh and a hiccup. I looked down at the 2 measuring tapes in my hands and the ridiculous pile of paper spread across the counter. It was the first time anyone had laughed since the hearing. The sound changed the room for about 5 seconds. Then Kara's eyes moved to the doorway again. She told me she could manage. She had managed worse. There were places already designed for wheelchairs, she said, and nobody needed to start rebuilding a house because of her. The last words came casually, but she had stopped looking at me. I folded the measuring tape slowly. She was not worried about whether my bathroom worked. She was trying to make herself cheaper to keep. I did not argue with her. Not then. I told both girls we were ordering dinner because I had reached the limit of my competence for one day. Lucy actually chose pepperoni when I gave her options, instead of saying she would eat anything. It felt absurdly important. While they settled in, I carried my purse into my bedroom and plugged in my phone. The screen lit with messages I had ignored during court. Several were from Monica, one from Scott. I could not bear either of them yet. Instead, I scrolled backward through the thread with my sister, looking for something practical about Kara's school schedule. 3 weeks earlier, on the first night Kara stayed longer than expected, Monica had sent me a message I had barely thought about at the time. I had read it then as a tired mother, asking her sister for help. Now the words looked different. "Can you keep Kara until Scott figures out what he's doing? Don't tell her it might be longer." I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone still glowing in my hand. 3 weeks ago. Before the hearing. Before Scott pointed toward Kara's wheelchair. Before Monica said neither could she. Before Kara asked me where she was supposed to go. My sister had already known Kara might not be coming back, and she had asked me to help keep that truth from her. I read Monica's message 3 times before I put the phone face down on my bed. "Can you keep Kara until Scott figures out what he's doing? Don't tell her it might be longer." 3 weeks earlier, I had seen a tired mother asking her sister for help. Now I saw the part I had missed. Monica had already been preparing for Kara not to come home, and she had wanted me to help make the transition gentle enough that Kara would not recognize it for what it was. I could hear the girls in the kitchen. Lucy was opening and closing cabinet doors in search of paper plates, even though mine were stacked exactly where they had been the last 6 times she had visited. Kara was telling her which drawer held the forks. Their voices were low and ordinary. After the courthouse, ordinary sounded almost sacred. I did not go out and confront them with what I had found. Kara had just spent the morning discovering, in public, that neither parent had prepared a place for her. She did not need me dropping another piece of proof into her lap before dinner. I took a screenshot of Monica's message and left the original untouched. Then I set my phone down and stood in the middle of my bedroom, looking at a room that had belonged only to me that morning. Everything in my life suddenly seemed to have a price tag attached to it. Not because Kara or Lucy were expensive in some abstract way, but because changing a life requires actual things: time, space, paperwork, gas, work hours, a safer entrance, a bathroom Kara could use without turning every movement into a calculation. That was the part people liked to skip when they talked about doing the right thing. The right thing still had to be done on Tuesday morning when you were late for work and nobody could find a clean sock. I learned that the next day. I woke before my alarm because I had spent most of the night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of two children sleeping under my roof. A floorboard creaked around 2. Water ran in the bathroom around 3:30. At 4, I heard one of the bedroom doors open, then close again. By 6, I had convinced myself I could compensate for every uncertainty by becoming extremely organized. That was my first mistake. I had lunches lined up on the counter, coffee in a travel mug, school forms beside my purse, Kara's folded chair cushion, where I thought it needed to be, and 3 alarms set on my phone. I even put my keys in a ceramic bowl by the door, instead of losing them in my purse like a normal person. Then I burned the toast. The smoke alarm started shrieking, while Lucy stood barefoot in the kitchen clutching 2 sandwich bags, and Kara was trying to angle around me to reach the table. Kara looked at the ceiling. If the smoke alarm joins the custody case, I'm moving out. Lucy laughed before she could stop herself. The laugh hit me harder than the alarm. I stood there waving a dish towel beneath the smoke detector, while both girls coughed and giggled, and for a few seconds the morning belonged to nobody's lawyer. Then Lucy noticed me looking at her and stopped. That was becoming a pattern. She could forget herself for a moment, but as soon as she sensed an adult watching, she corrected. I opened a window and scraped the blackened toast into the trash. Lucy had already moved on to packing lunches, even though I had not asked her to. She lined up fruit, crackers, and sandwiches, with the concentration of a woman catering a board meeting. I told her she did not have to do that. She said she liked helping. The answer came instantly. Kara, meanwhile, had decided my assistance with getting out the door was more dangerous than useful. She could transfer herself into my car, but I kept reaching toward the chair, the door, the backpack, anything that moved within 3 feet of her. The third time I asked whether she needed help, she gave me a look that said 15-year-old girls had been perfecting that expression since civilization began. She handled the transfer herself. I stood close enough to make myself feel useful and far enough away not to interfere. That balance turned out to be harder than it sounded. By the time I loaded the manual chair into the back, Lucy had put both lunches in the car, brought my travel mug from the kitchen, and run back inside, because I had forgotten the school forms I had so carefully placed beside my purse. We left 11 minutes later than I had planned. Nothing terrible happened. That surprised me. For the previous 24 hours, every inconvenience had felt like the opening move of a disaster. Instead, we got stuck behind a landscaping truck. Lucy complained about the radio station. Kara reminded me which school entrance had the curb cut. I dropped them off with 4 minutes to spare. Kara closed the car door, then leaned back through the open window, just enough to tell me not to arrive 40 minutes early that afternoon, because anxiety is not a transportation plan. I watched her roll toward the entrance beside Lucy. 2 sisters, one walking too fast, one telling her to slow down, neither looking back. I sat in the parking lot until the first bell rang. Then I drove to work. I had been a registrar long enough to know that institutions loved documents because documents turned human chaos into boxes somebody could check. Marriage certificate, divorce judgment, emergency contact, medical authorization, custody order. I had spent years telling students that wanting something badly did not change what paperwork was required. By 10 that morning, I was discovering how irritating that principle became when applied to me. The court agreement let the girls stay with me temporarily, but it did not make me a legal parent. The existing orders still controlled major decisions, so I spent my lunch hour learning what came next. Because the girls were physically living with me, and I was seeking a continuing custodial role, I could ask to be joined in the existing family case. Written parental permissions and the relative caregiver authorization could cover immediate school and routine medical needs while that process moved forward. The harder part was the standard for long-term custody. My attorney explained that good intentions would not be enough. The court would have to look at the harm of returning the girls to the existing pattern, and whether staying with me served their best interests. I was almost grateful for that. Monica and Scott would both insist they loved their daughters. Their actions would be harder to decorate. I signed what I could, noted what still had to be filed, and went back to my actual job, with half my mind already on the girls next week. At 3:20, my phone vibrated. Monica. I stared at her name until the screen went dark. Then it lit again. I did not answer immediately. I finished entering the student record in front of me, checked it twice, then stepped into an empty office. Monica did not waste time with apologies. She had apparently spent the morning convincing herself that the hearing had been misunderstood. She said she had been overwhelmed, that Scott had cornered her into answering before anyone had properly discussed Kara's needs, and that the temporary arrangement with me had never been intended to become something bigger. Most of it came in a rush. I let her finish. What she wanted was simple. Lucy could go back to Monica that night. That would, as Monica put it, take some pressure off me. The phrase made me grip the edge of the desk. Monica talked about Kara needing consistency. She talked about my house being quieter. She reminded me that I worked full-time. She even offered to send money for groceries and some accessibility equipment. All of it might have sounded responsible if she had been talking about both girls. She was not. She was offering to solve my burden by removing Lucy and leaving Kara behind. I told her I would not split them apart. There was a pause long enough for me to hear the air conditioner kick on above my head. Monica said I was making Lucy pay for something Scott had said. I looked through the small office window toward the rows of student records beyond it. There were hundreds of names in those files. Every one of them belonged to a person who had once been 12 or 15 and dependent on adults making decisions they had no power to control. "I'm not deciding which one is easier," I said. That was the only line I gave her. Everything after that could be summarized without losing anything. Monica accused me of overreacting. She insisted she was not rejecting Kara. She said she was trying to be realistic, and that I would understand once I had been responsible for Kara's schedule longer than a few weeks. That last part stayed with me after I ended the call. Not because she was right about Kara, because she was right about something else. I did not yet know how hard this was going to be. Pretending otherwise would not protect anybody. Scott called before dinner. His approach was almost the mirror image of Monica's. Where Monica wrapped everything in concern, Scott wrapped his in logistics. He said he could take Lucy that weekend and would happily keep her regularly while the court situation settled. Kara, he suggested, would probably prefer not to be moved again. Elaine's house was already working for her, and Scott could contribute financially in the meantime. He made responsibility sound like a reimbursement category. I did not argue. I told him the girls would follow the temporary arrangement and that any changes needed to go through the proper process. He did not like that answer. His irritation came through in the clipped way. He started repeating that he was Lucy's father, as if I had challenged the biology. I ended the call before he could turn it into a debate. For years, my instinct had been to smooth things over. That week I began discovering how much time you save when you stop explaining a boundary after someone has already understood it. The girls came home hungry. Lucy asked whether there was anything she could do before she had even set down her backpack. I told her homework would be enough. Kara disappeared into the room I had given her and returned 10 minutes later with the expression of someone determined not to mention that the desk height was wrong. I moved 2 storage boxes, took the adjustable legs off an old side table, and turned it into a workable surface until we could do something better. Kara watched me crawl around on the floor with a screwdriver. She did not thank me. I was relieved. Gratitude was beginning to feel dangerous in that house. Every time one of those girls thanked me for something basic, I heard the question underneath it. "Are you keeping score?" By Thursday, my life had divided into 3 calendars. My work calendar, the girls' schedule, and the legal list I kept pretending was not a calendar because it was written on yellow paper instead of inside my phone. Joan found me during lunch, with all 3 spread across my desk. I had known Joan Becker for 14 years. She was 62, had silver creeping into dark hair she refused to dye, and possessed the rare ability to insult your life choices in a way that made you feel cared for. She took one look at the papers, then at the unopened yogurt beside my keyboard. I gave her the shortened version of what was happening. She already knew the girls were staying with me, but not how many practical pieces had begun moving at once. She listened, without interrupting. Then she looked at the contractor number written beside the school schedule, the attorney notes tucked beneath it, and the message on my screen reminding me about Kara's transportation. You know, proving Kara isn't a burden does not require you to become one of those women they find asleep under a copier. I laughed. It escaped before I could decide whether I was in the mood. Joan did not laugh with me. She took my yogurt, peeled the lid back, and put the spoon in my hand. That was the extent of her rescue operation. No secret money, no cousin who happened to be a judge, no miraculous solution. Just a spoon and the deeply annoying suggestion that I eat lunch before saving the world. I had already begun turning competence into proof. If school ran on time, if I handled calls at lunch, if I could afford the ramp without complaining, then Monica and Scott would be wrong about Kara being too much. The trap was obvious once Joan had named it. I was still measuring Kara's right to belong against how painless I could make caring for her. Families cost time, money, patience, and sleep. Pretending otherwise would only keep the same cruel equation alive. Lucy was showing me the other side of it. That evening, I asked what she wanted for dinner. It was such a small question that I did not notice the first time she changed her answer. She said tacos. I opened the refrigerator and frowned because I was not sure we had enough tortillas. She immediately said pasta would be fine. I mentioned I had eaten pasta the night before. She switched to sandwiches. I looked at her. She looked back at me with a polite little smile. I asked again what she wanted. Lucy said anything was good. I told her that was not an answer. Her shoulders rose. She picked soup. Then she saw me glance toward the pantry and changed again. By the fourth answer, I stopped thinking about dinner. I pulled out a chair. Lucy remained standing. Her hands were folded in front of her like she was waiting to be graded. I told her there was no correct meal. That only made her face tighten. She tried one more time to tell me she would eat whatever I wanted. Then her eyes filled. Just pick. I'll like it. She said it like a promise. Something inside me went very still. Kara was in the doorway behind her. She did not make a joke. I looked at Lucy's small, careful face, and suddenly saw the cost of being the child everybody claimed to want. She had learned to study adults before she studied herself. She was not easy because that was simply her nature. She was making herself easy. I chose tacos because it had been her first answer. Then I asked her to help me check whether we had enough tortillas, not because I needed assistance, but because I needed the moment to become normal again. We did not discuss custody. We did not discuss why she was scared to choose dinner. She counted tortillas. Kara grated cheese. I burned nothing. For one evening, that was enough. The first home accessibility estimate arrived the following afternoon. It was not a catastrophic number, but it was enough to make me sit down. The contractor had separated immediate safety changes from things that could wait. A temporary entry solution was manageable. Some bathroom adjustments were manageable. Other improvements would have to happen in stages. I printed the estimate because I was still of the generation that trusted paper more than screens when money was involved. I left it on the dining table while I took a work call. When I came back, Kara was sitting beside it. She had not touched the paper. She did not need to. The total was printed in large type near the bottom. She asked whether all of it was for the house. I told her some of it was, and some could wait. She nodded. The expression on her face became carefully blank. Then she said she had never asked me to take her. It was not accusing. That made it worse. She reminded me there were places already designed for people who used wheelchairs. Programs. Housing. Other arrangements. She said I did not need to spend savings changing a house that had worked fine before she arrived. I wanted to tell her she was worth every dollar. The sentence rose automatically. I swallowed it. Money was real. The work was real. If I told her none of it mattered, she would know I was lying. So I told her we would decide what actually needed changing and what did not. I told her she would be part of those decisions. She did not look convinced. She rolled away from the table and went to her room. The estimate stayed where it was. Later, I moved it into a folder. Not because I wanted to hide the cost from her, because I was beginning to understand that the girls had spent too long listening to adults turn numbers, schedules, houses, and inconvenience into measurements of how much they were worth. By Friday afternoon, I had the first joinder paperwork underway, written permissions in place for routine school and medical matters, an appointment scheduled with the attorney, and a new appreciation for why people who said, "I'd do anything for my family," rarely listed forms among those things. I was leaving work when my phone notified me that a new document had been filed in the custody case. The attorney had arranged for me to receive the relevant filings as my participation moved forward. I opened the PDF in my car before starting the engine. Monica's declaration was several pages long. Most of it sounded like the sister I had known my entire life when she wanted to be reasonable. Calm language, careful phrases, repeated assurances that every decision had been made for the girls. Then I reached the paragraph about Kara. I read it once, then again. Monica had written, "Kara expressed a preference to remain with Elaine because Elaine's quieter household is better suited to her emotional needs." My fingers tightened around the phone. I could picture Kara at my kitchen table looking at the renovation estimate. I could hear her in the courthouse asking me where she was supposed to go. I could see the message Monica had sent 3 weeks earlier asking me not to tell Kara she might be staying longer. Kara had never told me she preferred my house. She had never told Monica she wanted to leave either parent. Yet there it was in a sworn court filing, polished until abandonment looked like preference. The filing showed me that Monica was doing more than explaining what she had done. She was trying to make Kara responsible for it. For the rest of that Friday, Monica's sentence stayed on the screen of my phone like something oily I could not wipe away. Kara expressed a preference to remain with Elaine because Elaine's quieter household is better suited to her emotional needs. It was not completely invented, which somehow made it worse. My house was quieter than Monica's new household. Kara had complained about moving her things between homes. She had been staying with me. If someone read only that paragraph, they could imagine a thoughtful mother listening carefully to a teenager who had asked for stability. That was how the lie worked. It borrowed just enough truth to make the rest respectable. I did not show the filing to Kara that evening. By then I had learned that there was a difference between keeping information from a child and choosing not to throw every adult problem onto her the second I received it. I forwarded the document to my attorney, put my phone away, and made myself finish the ordinary things that still had to happen. Laundry, dinner, a permission form Lucy had forgotten in the bottom of her backpack, the kind of chores that refused to become less important simply because somebody had lied in court. But the next morning, Kara came into the kitchen while I was measuring coffee into the machine and asked why I had been staring at my phone in the driveway the day before. She had always noticed more than people gave her credit for. I told her Monica had filed a declaration describing the current arrangement as something Kara had wanted. I kept the legal phrasing out of it. What mattered was the claim beneath it. Kara went still beside the table. For a few seconds, she only looked at the scratches in the wood. Then she told me what she had actually said. Months earlier, while the divorce schedule was still being shuffled every few days, she had complained to Monica that she hated moving everything from house to house. Her chair went with her, obviously, but so did cushions, school materials, shower equipment, medication, clothes, chargers, and the small collection of things adults tended to forget because they did not use them themselves. A transition that took Lucy 10 minutes could turn into an hour of checking whether something important had been left behind. Kara had said she wanted one place where she did not have to pack all the time. That was it. She had not said Elaine's house. She had not said Monica's. She had not said Scott's. She had certainly never said she wanted either parent to stop planning for her. She stared past me toward the living room while she explained it, her thumb running once along the side of her chair. I said I was tired of moving my stuff. I didn't say I was tired of them. That was one of the few sentences she gave me directly. It was enough. The coffee machine clicked behind me. I had forgotten to put the pot underneath it. A thin stream of coffee was spreading across the warming plate. Normally, Kara would have made a joke. Neither of us did. I cleaned up the mess while she sat at the table, and the ordinary motion helped me keep my hands steady. It would have been easy to tell her Monica had twisted her words because Monica was selfish. Easy to turn my anger into a version of the same thing the adults around Kara had been doing for months, telling her what other people meant, what she should think, what interpretation made sense. Instead, I asked whether she had told anyone else what she remembered saying. She said Marisol knew some of it already. That was better. Marisol Vega was Kara's court-appointed attorney. Priya Shah represented Lucy separately. The arrangement had seemed overly formal to me when I first heard about it. 2 girls, 2 lawyers, 2 sets of interviews, all because their parents could not manage a divorce without dragging them into the middle. Now I was grateful the separation existed. Kara and Lucy loved each other, but love did not make them one legal person. They might want different things. They might remember different details. They might even disagree. The court needed a way to hear each girl without making one responsible for the other. So did I. A few days later, I learned what it meant to stop standing beside the case and actually step into it. My attorney had filed the papers asking that I be joined as a claimant because the girls were physically living with me and I was seeking continuing custody rather than acting as an informal babysitter. There was no dramatic entrance. No one announced that Aunt Elaine had joined the battle. The hearing took less time than the first one and involved more paperwork than emotion. The judge reviewed the temporary arrangement, confirmed that both girls were still living with me, and granted the joinder. My attorney then formally asked that the temporary placement continue while the court gathered the information necessary to decide what happened next. My name now appeared in the case as something other than a relative mentioned in somebody else's declaration. It should have made me feel powerful. Mostly, it made me feel tired. There was something sobering about watching a clerk stamp a document that turned a promise made in a courtroom into a legal position I would now have to defend. The girls' placement with me continued while the matter moved forward. Their lawyers remained involved, and I was reminded in very clear terms that I was not to question the girls repeatedly about what had happened in either parent's home. That warning was not directed only at Monica and Scott. It applied to me too. At first I bristled, then I understood why. Children in custody fights get asked the same question until they begin hearing what adults want from the answer. Who said that? When did they say it? What did Mom mean? What did Dad do next? Are you sure? Did you tell anyone? Even a loving aunt can turn a kitchen table into an interview room if she is frightened enough. Marisol met with Kara privately. Priya met with Lucy. They did not report every word back to me, nor should they have. What they did explain was that the girls did not have to decide which adult deserved to win. They could speak about what they wanted, what had happened, and what made them feel safe or unsafe. Their wishes could even be different. When I repeated the last part to Lucy later, she looked at me as if I had told her gravity had been suspended. She had spent months believing every answer belonged to somebody. If she said she wanted to spend time with Monica, Scott might think she loved him less. If she enjoyed something at Scott's house, Monica might hear rejection. If she stayed close to Kara, one parent or the other treated it as proof she was being influenced. The idea that she could want something without it becoming a vote was almost new to her. That week, While preparing documents for my attorney, I went through my own messages. I did not need Monica's phone or Scott's. The requests were already in my thread. School pickups, last-minute overnights, rides to therapy, equipment I was asked to bring across town. A Tuesday in April, a Friday in May, 2 different weeks in June. Each message had looked like an isolated favor when it arrived. Lined up by date, they showed something else. Nobody had hidden the requests from me. I had simply kept solving the immediate problem without asking why the same emergency returned. My family had always rewarded the person who stepped in. Looking at the dates, I began to see how useful that made me to people who did not want the pattern examined. Kara rolled into the dining room while I was still looking at the messages. I closed nothing, but I did turn the phone toward myself. She had the right to know the broad issue. She did not need to sit beside me while I counted how many times her parents had passed her between adults. She noticed anyway. She asked whether there were a lot. I told her enough that I wished I had paid attention sooner. She looked at the papers for a moment, then said she had assumed I knew. That hurt more than accusation would have. Because from Kara's side, perhaps it had not looked like occasional help. Perhaps it had looked like the adults in her life had silently agreed that Aunt Elaine was the place she went when nobody else wanted to rearrange something. I did not apologize by making a speech about how much I loved her. I had begun to distrust speeches. I told her I should have asked more questions. She nodded once. Then she asked whether I had bought more of the cereal Lucy liked because apparently my house was now running a 12-year-old hostage negotiation before breakfast. The shift was deliberate. I let her make it. We were still allowed to talk about cereal. Monica came by the following Sunday. She asked in advance. And because the temporary arrangement allowed parental contact within agreed limits, I did not try to prevent it. The girls knew she was coming. Lucy disappeared into her room before the doorbell rang. Kara stayed in the living room with her tablet on her lap and headphones around her neck. Monica noticed both choices. Her mouth tightened. She brought a tote bag of clothes and a stack of school supplies that would have looked thoughtful if they had not arrived 2 months late. She did not start with the court filing. She started with our childhood. That was Monica's talent when facts became uncomfortable. She could pull you backward into a version of the family where you remembered protecting her before you remembered being angry with her. She reminded me how I had been the older sister who handled everything when our mother worked late. How I had sat with Monica after bad dates, helped her move apartments, stayed at the hospital after Kara's crash. Then, she talked about the years after that accident. Those years had been hard. I could admit that without giving away the argument. Kara had spent months in rehabilitation. Monica had learned equipment, insurance, school accommodations, appointments, bowel routines, transfer safety, skin checks, transportation schedules, and 1,000 details no parent imagines learning when she holds a newborn. Scott had learned them too, though not always with the same consistency. I had watched Monica age during that period. There had been nights she cried in my kitchen because she was afraid Kara would never forgive her body for changing. That history was real. So was Monica's exhaustion. For a few minutes, sitting across from my sister at the dining table, I could see the road that had brought her to this point, without pretending the destination was acceptable. She told me I did not understand what it was like to build an entire family schedule around one child's needs for years. I did not interrupt her. Then she said Lucy should come home with her while Kara stayed with me. That one sentence stripped the sympathy back to its proper size. Monica still thought the solution to her exhaustion was separation. She still thought Lucy belonged in the life she wanted, while Kara belonged in the place that could absorb more difficulty. Kara had gone very quiet in the living room. Monica lowered her voice, perhaps thinking that made what she was saying kinder. She told me Lucy needed normal routines, and that living in a house constantly changing for Kara could not be good for her either. I looked at the tote bag she had brought. 2 new shirts for Lucy were visible on top, Beneath them was a package of the socks Kara preferred because they did not bunch under her braces. That was the complexity of Monica. She remembered which socks Kara liked. She also wanted Kara to live somewhere else. People like to imagine cruelty requires the absence of love. It does not. Sometimes love and selfishness live in the same person, and the damage comes from which one gets to make the decisions. I did not fight with Monica in front of the girls. I told her the temporary placement would continue according to the court's order, and that any changes needed to go through the case. She left angry, not screaming, not threatening, just wounded enough to believe I had betrayed her. After the door closed, Lucy came out of her room, but did not ask what Monica had said. Kara picked up the package of socks from the tote bag. She stared at them for several seconds before putting them beside her chair. There was no expression on her face I could name, without pretending I knew too much. 2 days later, Scott decided to help me by hurting Monica. His attorney filed selected text messages between Scott and Monica. The purpose was obvious. Scott wanted the court to see how often Monica had canceled responsibilities, changed plans, or pushed Kara's appointments toward someone else. My attorney forwarded the filing to me. On the first read, Scott looked responsible. That lasted about 5 minutes. The messages he had selected showed Monica telling him she could not take Kara on a certain evening. They also showed Scott responding that he had already made plans and suggesting I handle it. Another thread began with Monica refusing a school pickup. Scott replied that he was out of town. The filing did not include what happened next, but I knew. I had the text he sent me 15 minutes later. Could I get Kara? Scott had tried to build a case showing Monica shifted responsibility. He had forgotten or hoped everyone else would forget that every time Monica pushed Kara toward him, he often pushed her one step farther. My attorney explained that because Scott had chosen to put selected portions of the communications into the record, the full relevant context could now be sought through normal litigation and discovery. We did not have the complete thread yet, so I could not assume what it would show. But Scott had created a lawful path to the fuller context himself. That evening, the girls had their worst fight since coming to my house. It started with something so small, I almost missed the moment it changed. Lucy had a school event coming up and wanted me to help her figure out what to wear. Kara was at the dining table, working on a digital illustration, headphones around her neck, but not over her ears. I mentioned that the same evening Kara had adaptive swimming information to sort out because I was still trying to find reliable transportation. Lucy dropped the shirt she had been holding onto the couch. She said she was tired of everything being about Kara. The room stopped. Lucy's face changed before anyone spoke. She had hurt herself. She tried to take it back, but Kara was quicker. Months of being the difficult child sat beneath the first words out of her mouth. She told Lucy that at least everyone wanted her. At least nobody was trying to figure out where to put her. Lucy's eyes filled. I never asked to be wanted like this. Neither girl shouted after that. They did not need to. Lucy went to the bedroom and shut the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Kara stared at her tablet screen without moving the stylus. I stood between them with the shirt still on the floor and understood that loving each other did not protect them from what their parents had done. It might even make parts of it worse. Lucy had guilt Kara did not want. Kara had resentment Lucy could not fix. I did not force them into an apology scene. I did not tell them sisters should never talk that way. I picked up the shirt and put it over the back of a chair. Dinner was quiet. An hour later, I heard the television turn on. Kara was in the living room. Lucy came out eventually and sat at the far end of the couch. They did not apologize. Not then. They watched half an episode in silence. Then Lucy reached for the remote at exactly the same moment Kara did. Kara got there first. Lucy accused her of cheating because she was closer. Kara told her proximity was not cheating and suggested Lucy study basic geometry. Within 30 seconds, they were arguing about which show to watch. I stood in the hallway where neither could see me and pressed my lips together to keep from laughing. After months of hearing them fight over parents, houses, schedules, and who had ruined whose life, hearing them fight over a streaming remote felt almost healthy. They were still angry. They were also still sisters. I went to bed that night thinking the worst thing we had uncovered so far was how each parent had begun shifting Kara away. I was wrong. The next afternoon, Priya contacted the adults through the proper channel after speaking privately with Lucy. She did not repeat every detail of the conversation. She did not hand us a transcript or invite us to question Lucy. She conveyed only what needed to affect the case. Lucy had remembered something she had not fully explained at the first hearing. The competition over her had not started with the July custody filings. It had started months earlier, before the lawyers began arguing over primary custody, before Monica described Kara as preferring my house, before Scott started presenting himself as the parent trying to fix Monica's failures. There had been a meeting at the family home. Both parents had been there. Both girls had been there, and according to Lucy, that was the first time Monica and Scott told their daughters there might be one child for each house. The choosing had started long before any of us knew there was a contest. The phrase, "one child for each house," followed me for the next 2 days. It sat in the back of my mind while I drove to work, while I folded laundry, while I stood in the grocery aisle comparing 2 brands of pasta sauce, as if either one mattered. I kept trying to picture the moment without inventing details Lucy had never given me. That was becoming one of the hardest disciplines of this whole situation, learning to resist the urge to fill every silence with an explanation. All I knew for certain was what Priya had conveyed through the proper channels after speaking with Lucy privately. Months before the custody filings, before Kara began staying with me more often, Monica and Scott had sat both girls down and told them there might be one child in each parent's household. Then they had asked the girls which parent they wanted. Not which school worked better, not which schedule felt easier, not what support Kara needed. Which parent? Which house? Which child went where? I had spent years thinking divorce became ugly when adults fought over children. I had not understood there was something worse. Adults could make children do the dividing for them. The lawyers did not turn Lucy's account into a public spectacle. Priya did not hand me a transcript and invite me to pick through every word. What came to me was a careful summary of the facts that mattered to the case. Monica and Scott had proposed separate residences for the sisters. They had presented the idea as practical. They had asked both girls to participate in choosing. Kara refused. Lucy followed her. The rest came together through details I already knew. Kara had always hated being spoken about, as if she were not in the room. Even before the divorce, she had corrected adults who said she couldn't do things, when the real issue was that nobody had planned how she could do them. I could imagine her reaction to being told that 2 households would be easier if each child simply went to one. I did not need to invent her exact words. I knew the result. She had refused. Lucy had refused too. For a while, apparently, that should have ended it. It did not. What followed had not looked like punishment from the outside. It had looked like planning. That was why I had missed it. Over the next week, information began settling into a shape I could recognize. Lucy's account, the messages already in my possession, and the broad timeline the girls' attorneys were helping establish all pointed in the same direction. After the sisters refused to split themselves, Monica and Scott stopped asking the question directly. They started selling futures. Monica talked to Lucy about the room she could have in the house she hoped to share with Ethan and his son. She talked about school, a different routine, a neighborhood where Lucy already knew people. Nothing about those conversations sounded sinister by itself. Parents talk about bedrooms. Parents talk about school. Scott did the same thing from another angle. He talked about weekend trips, activities, a little more freedom, less structure, the possibility of doing things on short notice now that he was no longer living inside the old family rhythm. Lucy received invitations. Kara received logistics. who had room for her chair, which bathroom could be modified, who could handle transportation, whether moving her equipment was practical, whether she would be more settled somewhere else. Once I saw the difference, it became impossible not to see it. The parents had stopped asking the girls to choose. They had begun telling Lucy what she could gain, and telling themselves why Kara belonged somewhere else. I sat with that one evening at my kitchen table after both girls had gone to their rooms. The air conditioner was working hard against a hot September night, and the glass of water beside me had left a wet circle on the wood. I kept remembering things that had meant nothing when they happened. Lucy asking me, months earlier, whether sisters could live in two families at the same time. I had told her children of divorced parents did that all the time. She had nodded and gone quiet. At the time, I had thought I had answered the question. Now I realized I had answered the wrong one. Another memory surfaced. Kara arriving at my house in June with more belongings than usual. Not a suitcase exactly. A backpack, a second bag, her shower equipment, 2 sketchbooks, and the charger she usually kept at Monica's. I had joked that she was moving in. Kara had smiled without answering. Monica had said it was easier to send everything because schedules were changing. I had accepted that too. There were more. A Saturday when Scott dropped Kara off early because something had come up, then picked up Lucy hours later for dinner. A week when Monica asked me to handle 2 of Kara's school pickups, but somehow still found time to take Lucy shopping. A call from Kara asking whether she could stay one more night, because neither parent seemed sure who was supposed to have her. I had treated each event as a small emergency. Now they looked like rehearsals. Guilt made me move faster. I started answering needs before anyone could voice them, as if speed could make up for every question I had failed to ask. I was up before 6 checking transportation, lunches, school calendars, and work messages. I stayed late at the college after leaving early for appointments, spent evenings comparing ramp systems, and filled 3 notebooks before adding sticky notes to the system. By then I was eating at my desk and answering emails while cooking. Joan found me in the break room with crackers in one hand, court forms in the other, and a yellow note stuck to my sleeve. You've built a support plan with 1 employee. Unfortunately, the employee is you. She peeled off the note. Call ramp company, and pointed me toward the lunch I had forgotten in the refrigerator. Her joke exposed what I was doing. I had made myself the single point of failure because I was afraid that needing help would prove Monica and Scott right about Kara. The girls noticed before I corrected course. The girls noticed my exhaustion before I admitted it. Lucy started cleaning up things nobody had asked her to clean. She folded towels that were already folded. She kept offering to help me with dinner even when homework was waiting. Kara went the opposite direction. She asked for less. One evening, she told me she could skip adaptive swimming for a while because transportation was complicated. Another day, she said the bathroom setup was good enough, though I had seen her struggling with the angle of the temporary grab bar. She stopped mentioning a charger that had begun cutting out unless she held the cord a certain way. Each time I tried to solve something, she found a reason it could wait. For a few days, I told myself that meant she was adjusting. Then I came home early enough to find her at the dining table, with one of the accessibility estimates spread beside her tablet. She had not heard me enter. The estimate listed immediate changes, optional changes, and costs. Kara's eyes moved over the numbers slowly. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have. She was not crying. That would have been easier. She was calculating. I could see it in the set of her jaw, and the way she zoomed in on one section, then another. What does this cost? What does that cost? What does it cost to keep me? I stepped into the room and let my bag make enough noise against the chair that she would know I was there. She minimized the screen on her tablet. The estimate stayed open. I told her some of those changes could wait. She said she knew. Then she asked how much time I had taken off work that month. The question landed harder than it should have. I answered honestly. Not enough to threaten my job, but enough that I had begun shifting hours and using leave. Kara nodded. She did not say anything else. That silence worried me more than a fight would have. The next several days, she became almost aggressively independent. She refused help with the car unless absolutely necessary. She transferred without letting me stand close. She stopped asking me to carry things even when doing it herself meant 3 trips. I finally told her she was allowed to let me help. She gave me a thin smile. I know, but she did not. Not really. And neither did I. The legal side kept moving around us. Monica did not deny discussing separate residences. She described the conversation as giving the girls agency and reducing conflict. Scott framed it as respecting individual needs. On paper, one child with each parent had been polished into a child-centered plan. My first instinct was to answer every sentence. My attorney stopped me. The case needed facts and patterns, not 10 pages of anger, so I let the filings stand long enough for the evidence to catch up with them. At home, life continued to resist becoming purely legal. Lucy had a school project that somehow required half the dining table. Kara was working on a digital design for the school paper and complaining that another student had chosen a font she described as a crime against vision. I bought the wrong kind of cereal and received more criticism for that than I had for anything I said in court. Those little complaints were becoming precious to me. Every ordinary irritation meant the girls were spending at least a few minutes thinking about something other than custody. Still, the tension remained underneath. One night, I woke around 1 a.m. and saw light beneath Kara's bedroom door. I almost knocked. Then I stopped. She was 15. Teenagers were allowed to stay awake too late without it becoming evidence of trauma. That was another thing I was having to learn, how not to turn every behavior into a symptom. I went back to bed. The following afternoon, a memory came through the legal process that changed the shape of the choosing game again. Lucy had remembered more of the argument that followed the family meeting. Not everything, only fragments, which no one treated like a recording. But the central sequence was consistent. After the girls refused to choose which parent they would live with, Monica and Scott argued later in the kitchen. Lucy had been close enough to hear. Monica said Scott should take Kara, because his household would have fewer people and therefore more room to deal with what Kara needed. Scott pushed back. He said Monica had always managed Kara's routines better, and that moving her care to him made no sense. The argument went in circles. Neither parent said they wanted Kara. They argued over which one had the stronger reason not to take her. I read the summary twice. Then I reached the line Lucy remembered most clearly. Monica had finally said, "Fine. Then we both know which one we're actually fighting over." Lucy had not understood what it meant at the time. I did. The sentence sat in my chest like something heavy. The parents had first asked the girls to divide themselves. When that failed, they had begun competing for Lucy. And somewhere in the middle of that competition, Kara had stopped being a child either parent was fighting to keep. I came home that evening carrying a folder of documents and a headache. The house was too quiet. Lucy was at a friend's house working on a school project. Kara had told me she would be home. Her chair was beside the dining table. Her backpack was there. Her tablet was open. No Kara. For half a second, panic went through me before I heard the shower running. I set my folder down and told myself not to become ridiculous. By the time Kara came out, I had made tea and opened my laptop to check a work message. She rolled past me toward her room. I noticed something on the screen of the tablet she had left behind. An email window. I looked away. Then I saw my own name in the visible line. I did not touch the device. I did not open a hidden message. The email was already displayed across the screen in large text, the last paragraph visible from where I sat. It was addressed to an adaptive youth residential program. Kara had asked whether a 15-year-old could apply voluntarily. She explained that her aunt had taken her in after a custody problem. She wrote that the house needed changes. She wrote that her aunt had already missed work. She wrote that she did not want her little sister moved again. Then came the sentence that stopped me. I just want to know if there's somewhere I can go so my family won't have to change everything for me. I did not hear Kara come back into the room. When I looked up, she was watching me. Not ashamed, not exactly angry, prepared. That expression told me she had already imagined this conversation, maybe many times. For months, I had been furious at Monica and Scott for teaching Kara she was the child nobody wanted to rearrange a life for. And while I was trying desperately to prove them wrong, Kara had been watching me exhaust myself. She had reached her own conclusion. If everyone eventually got tired enough, the kindest thing she could do was leave first. Kara stood in the dining room doorway, watching me look at the email she had left open on her tablet. I did not pretend I had not seen it. I also did not reach for the device, scroll farther, or ask who she had contacted. The sentence already visible on the screen had given me more than enough. I just want to know if there's somewhere I can go so my family won't have to change everything for me. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The refrigerator hummed behind me. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the block, the ordinary sound almost offensive against the weight that had settled inside the room. My first impulse was the wrong one. I wanted to tell her she was not going anywhere. I wanted to tell her I would change 100 houses before I let anybody send her away. I wanted to tell her she was worth every dollar, every missed hour of work, every contractor estimate, every form stacked beside my bed. All of those things were true in the way people mean them when they are frightened. They were also exactly the kind of sentences Kara had learned not to trust. I had spent the previous month watching adults take complicated realities and cover them with simple words. Stability, preference, practicality, best interest. Love could become another one if I used it badly enough. So I closed the laptop I had been working on and asked the only question that seemed honest. What do you think will happen if you stay? Kara's eyes shifted toward the hallway. For a moment, I thought she would make a joke. She did not. She rolled farther into the room and stopped across from me. Her posture had that controlled stiffness I had begun to recognize. The one that meant she had already had the argument alone in her head and expected me to react badly. She started with the ramp, then the bathroom, then my work schedule. She reminded me I had already used leave days, that I had taken calls during lunch, that I had spent part of my savings on temporary changes and consultations. She had noticed the grocery bill growing. She had noticed that Lucy needed new school clothes. She had noticed that I had fallen asleep at the kitchen table 2 nights earlier with an open legal pad under my hand. Every detail was accurate. That was what made it hard to interrupt. Kara had not invented my exhaustion. She had simply given it a meaning I had never intended. When she finally looked at me, her face was calm. Everywhere I go, somebody has to give something up. The sentence was quieter than anything Monica or Scott had said in court. It hurt more. I sat back in my chair. There was a version of me, only a few weeks earlier, who would have rushed to erase every example she had listed. I would have told her the ramp did not matter, the money did not matter, work did not matter. None of it was a sacrifice. But that would have required lying to her. The ramp mattered. Money mattered. I was tired. My life had changed. I had spent years living in a house arranged exactly the way I liked it. I worked a stable job with predictable hours. I could come home and eat cereal for dinner if I wanted. I could leave on a Saturday morning without checking school schedules, medication, transportation, or whether a teenager needed a ride across town. Now, there were 2 backpacks by my front door, 3 calendars competing for space on my refrigerator, and a stack of legal documents where I used to keep mail I planned to ignore. It was harder. Pretending otherwise would only teach Kara that belonging required me to conceal the cost. So I told her the truth. The house needed changes. My schedule needed changes. Some of those changes cost money. I was tired because I had tried to do too much myself. Then I told her the part I wished somebody had taught both of us years earlier. Hard isn't the same as unwanted. Kara looked down at her hands. I let the words stop there. No speech. No promise that I would never resent a bad day. No dramatic declaration that love solved everything. I could not guarantee a life without frustration. I could guarantee that frustration would not be used as a vote on whether she got to stay. That conversation did not fix Kara. It changed me first. By Monday, I had begun dismantling the one-person system I had built. At work, I asked for predictability rather than fewer hours and arranged a temporary schedule that let me cluster appointments instead of lurching between emergencies. I also stopped treating existing transportation, school, medical, and community supports as evidence that I could not manage. Ben came down from Oregon for a weekend later that month. I did not turn him into a rescuer. He moved a cabinet, drove us to the hardware store, took Lucy for burgers, while Kara and I met a contractor, and then went home to his own life. That kind of limited help was exactly what I had been refusing to accept. Kara noticed. She still watched the money, but not every time I opened my banking app. My first estimates had been built around my panic. I had shown people every possible inconvenience and asked what could be done. That approach produced a list long enough to renovate half the house. This time, Kara sat at the table with me. The contractor suggested widening one doorway immediately, replacing another threshold, adding permanent grab bars, adjusting the sink clearance, and considering a more extensive bathroom renovation later. I started writing everything down. Kara stopped me halfway through. She explained that one of the suggested changes would not make much difference for the way she actually transferred. Another expensive feature was designed for somebody who needed more upper body assistance than she did. A third change could wait because the current setup was inconvenient rather than unsafe. I had spent weeks arguing that adults should stop making decisions about Kara without asking her. Then, I had almost remodeled my house the same way. That realization arrived without needing to be named. I put down my pen and let her explain what she actually needed. By the time the contractor left, the immediate plan was shorter, cheaper, and better. Kara looked at the revised estimate. "Congratulations. We just saved enough money for you to keep buying terrible meatloaf." I stared at her. My meatloaf had been the subject of family disrespect for years. Ben used to claim it could survive structural impact. I had considered his opinion invalid, because he once ate frozen pizza 3 nights in a row. Kara's mouth twitched. I told her there was nothing wrong with my meatloaf. She rolled toward the hallway with the expression of someone unwilling to debate obvious facts. Lucy, who had heard the exchange from the living room, announced that she agreed with Kara. I should have taken that as a warning. A few nights later, I made meatloaf. Not because I wanted to prove anything, mostly because the ingredients were already in the refrigerator and I had spent enough money that week. It came out worse than usual. I knew it before I set it on the table. The top had dried into something that looked less cooked than preserved. I sliced into it and discovered the middle had somehow achieved the opposite problem. Kara examined her plate with open suspicion. Lucy took one bite. Her face tightened. Then, perhaps because she had spent weeks practicing honesty in our house and had not yet learned the value of moderation, she said my meatloaf should be illegal. I laughed. Kara nearly choked on her water. Lucy smiled for half a second. Then, I told her she still needed to speak respectfully about food somebody had made for her. The smile vanished. She pushed back from the table harder than necessary, muttered that she was not hungry, and slammed one of the kitchen cabinets while putting away her glass. The sound cracked through the room. Lutzefroze. Her hand stayed on the cabinet handle. The color drained from her face. I watched the transformation happen. 1 second she was an annoyed 12-year-old. The next she was the child who had learned that being difficult could alter where she belonged. She looked toward me without moving. I could almost see her calculating. How angry was I? Had she gone too far? Was this the moment being wanted became conditional? I did not hug her. I did not tell her the cabinet did not matter. It did. We had rules. I told her slamming things and speaking rudely still had consequences in my house. She could clear the table after dinner and lose some screen time that evening. Her eyes widened, not because the punishment was harsh, because that was all it was, a consequence, not exile. I also looked down at the meatloaf and admitted we were not eating it. Kara had already pushed her plate 2 inches away. I ordered pizza. Lucy stared at me. The tension in her shoulders loosened so slowly I might have missed it a month earlier. By the time the delivery arrived, she was helping put plates out without being asked. I stopped her and told her she could sit down. She sat. That was progress too. Halfway through dinner, Kara informed me that losing a fight to my own meatloaf was probably a character-building experience. Lucy laughed again. This time, she did not stop when I looked at her. The next few days were quieter. Not easy. Quieter. Kara began telling me when something in the house did not work instead of silently adjusting around it. Once she asked me to move a small rug because the edge caught her front caster at the wrong angle. The request took 10 seconds. A month earlier, she would have spent a week driving around it. Lucy made a face at breakfast one morning when I bought the wrong cereal. She did not immediately apologize. I had never imagined I would measure healing in complaints about cereal and floor rugs. Then Scott reminded me how quickly progress inside a house could collide with the fight outside it. His request came through the proper channel because by then I had made it clear I was no longer changing the girls' arrangements informally whenever one parent wanted something convenient. He wanted a special weekend with Lucy. There was an event he thought she would enjoy, followed by an overnight at his place. The request did not include Kara. That omission mattered more than the event itself. Scott's position was that Kara would probably prefer staying with me rather than dealing with the logistics. He used the same language he always used when he wanted exclusion to sound like accommodation. Before, I might have called him directly. I might have argued that the sisters should stay together. I might have asked Kara whether she minded, then asked Lucy how she felt, turning our kitchen into another custody negotiation. I did none of those things. I forwarded the request to my attorney and followed the temporary order. That was not because Lucy could never spend time alone with her father. In a healthy family, siblings do separate things. Kara did not need to attend every activity Lucy attended, and Lucy should not be forced into permanent togetherness as proof she loved her sister. The problem was the pattern. Scott was still treating Lucy as the child he planned experiences around, while treating Kara as the child who stayed wherever was easiest. Until the court and the girls' own counsel could separate ordinary individual time from the old choosing game, I was not going to improvise. Scott responded badly, not explosively. He sent a message through counsel accusing me of making normal father-daughter time unnecessarily complicated. For once, I did not spend the evening constructing a perfect answer in my head. I made dinner, not meatloaf. The legal process could handle the rest. That boundary gave me room to notice something else developing in the evidence. The school district had records related to transportation and pickup issues that had become relevant once the custody dispute expanded, and my role in the case was formalized. Those records were obtained through the proper legal process, rather than handed casually to me, because I was an aunt. My attorney summarized the first batch before sending the relevant documents. Most were boring. Schedule notices, contact lists, routine transport confirmations. A few showed the exact kind of confusion I remembered from spring. Then one email caught my attention. It had been written by a school staff member after Kara remained at school past the normal accessible transportation window. The message was factual rather than emotional. That made it more useful. Neither Monica nor Scott had confirmed responsibility for Kara's pickup. The school had contacted both. Eventually, they had called me. I remembered the day. I had been at work when the office number appeared on my phone. The staff member told me Kara was still waiting and asked whether I could come. I had left early. Kara had been sitting near the front office with her backpack across her lap, angry more than frightened. I remembered apologizing for being late, even though I had not been the one scheduled to get her. At the time, Monica later told me Scott had misunderstood the schedule. Scott told me Monica had changed plans. I had assumed two divorced parents had failed to communicate. The email showed something else. That was not the first time. The staff member had written, "This is the third occasion this month neither parent has confirmed responsibility for Kara's pickup." Third. I read the line again. The date was from early spring. Months before Monica and Scott filed their competing request to change custody. Months before Monica declared that Kara preferred my quieter house. Months before the courtroom, hearing where Scott said he could not build his new life around Kara's level of care. I pulled up my own messages from that date. Scott had texted me after the school called. "Could I get Kara?" Monica had sent something similar 20 minutes later. Neither message mentioned that the school had already contacted both of them. Neither said this had happened twice before. I had thought I was solving one bad afternoon. The record said I had been stepping into a gap that already had a history. I sat at my dining table with the school email open beside my phone. Kara was in her room working on an illustration. Lucy was on the couch, complaining to a friend about a math assignment. The house sounded ordinary. That was what made the document on the table feel so ugly. Monica and Scott would later describe the custody fight as a crisis that forced difficult choices. The date on that email told a different story. They had been shifting Kara away from themselves months before anyone asked a judge to change custody. The court battle had not created the pattern. It had only given the pattern paperwork. The school email changed the shape of the case because it put a date beside something I had only felt until then. Third occasion this month neither parent has confirmed responsibility for Kara's pickup. It was from early spring, months before the custody filings, and months before Monica wrote that Kara preferred my quieter house. The note itself was ordinary. A staff member had documented a recurring problem because recurring problems eventually become somebody's responsibility to record. My attorney reminded me that the record mattered as part of a larger pattern, not as a moral victory over Monica or Scott. I put it into the case folder and went home to the harder work of building a life where the girls did not spend every evening listening to adults discuss the worst things that had happened to them. That week, our biggest argument was over laundry. Kara had discovered I was folding her shirts differently from the way she liked them stored. She informed me that because she had spent 15 years learning how she wanted her own clothes arranged, I was not authorized to create a new filing system. Lucy sided with her. I told both of them that anyone criticizing my folding technique was welcome to take over the task. They did. By Thursday, there were neatly stacked shirts in Kara's drawer, 3 unfolded hoodies on Lucy's chair, and I had learned that surrendering control could occasionally save me 20 minutes. It was a small victory. Then Ethan called. He did not call me directly at first. He sent a short message asking whether we could speak about something Monica had told him. By then, the case had made me careful. I did not want private conversations drifting into places they did not belong, and I had no interest in becoming the person who fed Monica's fiancé confidential information about the girls. I told him he could come by if the girls' schedules allowed, but I would not discuss anything their attorneys had told me privately. He agreed. Ethan arrived Saturday afternoon while Lucy was at a friend's house, and Kara was in her room finishing a design project. He looked older than the last time I had seen him socially, though only a few months had passed. He had always carried himself like a man who liked plans. Neat shirts, clean car, appointments entered into his phone before anyone else had finished making them. That day, he stood in my kitchen holding his keys too tightly. He did not ask whether Monica was a bad mother. He asked whether Kara had really chosen not to live with Monica. I did not answer the question. I could have told him immediately that Monica's declaration was disputed. I could have repeated what Kara had told me. Instead, I asked him why he believed Kara had made that choice. The change in his face told me the question had landed somewhere uncomfortable. Months earlier, before the divorce was final, Ethan and Monica had been discussing where they might eventually live together. Ethan had a 14-year-old son. Monica had 2 daughters. Whatever house they chose would need to function for all 3 children. Ethan told me he had specifically raised accessibility, not because anyone had forced him to, because Kara used a wheelchair, and he assumed that if she was part of their family, the house needed to work for her. He had apparently asked whether they should focus on single-story homes, wider entrances, or a place that could be modified without major work. Monica had told him not to worry about it. According to her, Kara had already made it clear she preferred living somewhere else. Ethan had taken that as settled. I looked at him across my kitchen table and felt a strange mixture of anger and relief. For months, Monica had spoken as if her future with Ethan came with unavoidable limitations. A household already forming. His son. Space. Routines. Practicality. But Ethan had not told her Kara was too complicated. He had asked whether they should choose a house that included her. Monica had removed the problem before it was ever placed in front of him. I did not tell Ethan what to do with that. I did not need to. He sat with the information for a while. His eyes moved toward the hallway leading to Kara's room, then back to the keys in his hand. He admitted there had been other moments he had ignored. Not dramatic ones. That was important. Kara gradually disappeared from conversations about future plans. Monica would talk about Lucy's possible school, Lucy's room, the schedule with Ethan's son. When Ethan asked where Kara fit, Monica usually said something had not been decided, or that Kara wanted more stability somewhere else. He had accepted it because the divorce was ugly, and he was afraid of becoming the new man barging into a custody fight. He said he told himself it was not his place. I knew the excuse because I had used my own version of it. Not my marriage, not my divorce, not my place to interfere. Boundaries can be responsible, but they can also become comfortable hiding places. Ethan had seen Kara slowly disappear from the future he was planning with Monica, and accepted explanations that made the disappearance easier not to question. He said he wished he had asked Kara directly. I told him the children had already been asked to manage too much adult uncertainty. If he wanted to help now, he could give a truthful account of what he personally knew and let the legal process handle the rest. He later provided that account formally through counsel. He left without asking to see Kara. I respected him more for that. The conversation unsettled me for the rest of the day, because it removed one of the excuses I had almost unconsciously given Monica. I had assumed part of her rejection came from trying to fit into Ethan's household. That did not make it right, but it gave the cruelty a structure. New relationship, new child in the house, accessibility problems, conflict avoidance. Now that structure had begun to collapse. Ethan had been willing to consider changes. Monica had told him they were unnecessary. She had treated Kara's absence as a fact before Kara ever chose it. Scott's excuse came apart 2 days later in a narrower way. Dana, the physical therapist assistant he was seeing, had once helped look at rental options for a weekend trip with the girls. Knowing Kara used a wheelchair, she suggested an accessible place so both girls could go without turning entry, bathroom access, or sleeping arrangements into a last-minute scramble. Scott dismissed the idea, telling Dana that Kara hated trips now and would probably rather stay home. Dana later gave that same first-hand account through counsel. When Kara was asked only whether Scott had ever invited her on that trip, she looked genuinely confused. He had not. One vacation could not decide custody, but the choice fit the same pattern. Scott had described exclusion as Kara's preference without asking her. When Monica learned Ethan had spoken about the house conversation, she reacted exactly the way I should have expected. She did not first ask whether what he had said was true. She asked why he had spoken to me. The difference mattered. I did not witness their private argument, so I only knew what followed from the parts Ethan later provided through the proper process and from what Monica herself said to me. Their engagement had developed a crack neither could ignore. Ethan asked her directly whether Kara had actually chosen not to live with them. Monica did what she had done in court filings. She answered around the question. She talked about Kara being tired of transitions, about the instability of the old schedule, about the physical layout of potential homes. about how unfair it was to expect every household decision to revolve around one person's needs. Every statement contained something true. None answered Ethan. He wanted to know whether Kara had made the choice Monica attributed to her. Monica never gave him a simple yes. That silence apparently changed something between them. Not everything. They did not end the engagement that night. This story was not going to hand me consequences in neat packages every time someone lied. But Ethan stopped repeating Monica's version automatically, and Monica knew it. Her next messages to me became colder. She accused me of involving people who had nothing to do with the custody case, and warned me that I was poisoning her future family against her. I did not respond to that accusation. Ethan had come to me. Dana had spoken about something she personally experienced. Nobody needed me to conduct a campaign. That was the part Monica seemed unable to accept. Once people began comparing what she had told them, I no longer had to convince anyone of anything. Her versions were meeting each other. Scott minimized Dana's account as an ordinary travel discussion, being twisted into something larger. On that narrow point, he was right. One abandoned vacation could not decide custody. Its significance came from repetition. A missed pickup, a canceled overnight, a trip planned without asking Kara. Each event could be defended separately, but the explanations kept ending with Kara somewhere else. Meanwhile, life in my house began improving in ways that had nothing to do with legal filings. School mornings stopped feeling like military operations. I learned not to stand over Kara during transfers. Lucy learned that shoes left in the middle of the hallway might be run over without apology. Joan called the schedule on my refrigerator an air traffic control system, and dinner improved once I accepted that nobody wanted my meatloaf. The biggest change came when Kara decided to return to adaptive swimming. She had stopped going regularly during the worst months of the custody chaos, because transportation became one more thing Monica and Scott passed back and forth. By the time she came to me, she talked about swimming like something she used to do rather than something still available to her. Once transportation became dependable, I asked whether she wanted to go back. She said maybe. For Kara, maybe usually meant yes, if nobody made a big emotional production out of it. So I signed nothing without asking her, scheduled nothing behind her back, and waited. She chose a Saturday session. The pool building smelled of chlorine before we even reached the deck. The air was warmer than outside, and every sound echoed water slapping tile, whistles, conversations bouncing off concrete walls. I had seen Kara swim before the divorce got ugly, but not recently. I had forgotten how different she looked in water. Not transformed, not cured. Free of the constant negotiations the built environment forced on her. She was still Kara, competitive enough to glare at another teenager who reached the wall ahead of her, impatient with instructions she already knew, annoyed when I stood too close while she handled part of her transfer. Alive, that was the word I kept returning to. Not inspiring. Alive. Lucy and I sat where we could watch without hovering. At one point, Kara finished a lap faster than I expected, and I cheered too loudly. Several people looked at me. Kara closed her eyes. Lucy immediately copied my cheer at twice the volume. Kara pointed toward us from the water. If either of you does that again, I'm splashing both of you. It was an empty threat from that distance. Lucy took it seriously enough to cheer once more. Kara splashed toward the edge anyway. Some of the water reached Lucy's shoes. Lucy accused her of attempted murder. I laughed so hard my stomach hurt. For a few minutes, there were no lawyers or declarations in my head, just a teenager in a pool annoyed by her aunt and little sister. That was what the stability at home was supposed to buy them, enough room for ordinary life to matter again. After swimming, Kara complained about my cheering for most of the drive home. Lucy defended me only because it irritated Kara more. We stopped for fries. Kara stole half of Lucy's. Lucy threatened to invoice her. Nothing important happened. That made it important. Over the next couple of weeks, those changes became visible outside my house. Kara's attendance and transportation stayed steady. Lucy had a friend over, and Kara returned to swimming without treating it like a major milestone. School staff increasingly contacted me first for practical coordination because I was the adult consistently handling it. Family news traveled in small pieces: a picture from the pool, a comment about Lucy's friend, somebody hearing the bathroom work was nearly done. Monica and Scott both understood the same thing. The arrangement they had tolerated as temporary was beginning to look like the girls' actual life. Monica started asking for more updates. Not just about the girls' health or school. About routines. Who was driving them? Who Lucy was seeing? Whether Kara had resumed activities. Scott began doing the same thing through different channels. He wanted additional time, more flexibility, more direct access to school information. He already had rights to, under the existing orders. At first I told myself this might be good. Maybe the possibility of losing ordinary involvement had finally forced them to understand what they had been giving away. I wanted that to be true. For the girls' sake, I wanted their parents to wake up. Then the timing became impossible to ignore. A scheduled review hearing was approaching. My temporary custody claim was no longer hypothetical. The court had a growing record of stability in my home, and within the same week, not the same day, not by coincidence, but as the review deadline approached, both Monica and Scott filed new requests. Monica asked for Lucy to return to her primary physical custody and described Kara's placement with me as something that could be reassessed separately. Scott sought substantially more time with Lucy and argued that his relationship with his younger daughter was being weakened by the temporary arrangement. His proposal for Kara was more cautious, filled again with phrases about gradual transition and individual needs. I read both filings at my kitchen table after the girls went to bed. Months earlier, each parent had looked at Kara and seen a life they did not want to rearrange. Now they were looking at my house and seeing something else. A family continuing without them. That frightened them. Not enough to agree on what was best for both girls. Not enough to stop separating Kara from Lucy in their proposals. But enough to suddenly want more control. Both parents were asking the court for more time. Neither one had asked Kara or Lucy first what they wanted. The filings arrived 3 days apart, but they might as well have been written at the same table. Monica wanted Lucy returned to her primary physical custody. Kara, she argued, should remain with me for the time being because too many transitions would be disruptive. Scott wanted substantially more time with Lucy and described Kara's situation as something that required a slower, separate plan. Different lawyers, different wording, same result. Lucy went back into motion between the parents. Kara stayed where she was. I sat at my dining table with both filings open and felt something colder than anger settle over me. Months earlier, Monica and Scott had called my house temporary because it allowed them to postpone a decision about Kara. Now that both girls had begun settling there, temporary had become a problem. They were not asking the court to restore the old shared schedule for both daughters. They were each asking for Lucy. Kara remained a footnote attached to phrases about caution, stability, and individual needs. The review hearing was approaching, which explained why the timing suddenly mattered. The temporary arrangement had lasted long enough for the court to have information it had not possessed in August. School transportation was stable. The girls were attending activities. The home modifications were working. I had been joined in the case and was no longer just the relative standing behind everybody else's custody dispute. The court was going to have to decide whether this arrangement continued. Monica and Scott had finally understood that doing nothing might produce a result they could no longer control. That was when they started remembering themselves differently. Monica's filing described the first courtroom hearing as a moment of emotional overload. According to her, she had never rejected Kara. She had merely acknowledged that my home offered temporary advantages while the adults worked out a more sustainable plan. Scott's version was even cleaner. He claimed he had always remained open to parenting both girls, but had believed I was volunteering to provide short-term stability while accessibility concerns were resolved. I read that paragraph twice. I could still see his hand moving toward Kara's wheelchair. I could still hear him saying he could not build his new life around that level of care. There is a strange kind of violence in watching someone edit a memory you were present for. Not because memory is perfect, mine was not, but because I had spent months trying to be careful about what I claimed. I had stopped myself from guessing what happened in conversations I did not hear. I had learned to separate what the girls told their lawyers from what I personally knew. I had begun treating every fact like a fragile object that had to be carried by the proper person. Monica and Scott had no such problem. If a past decision looked ugly in the present, they polished it. If a sentence had become inconvenient, they changed what they said it meant. If Kara had been left somewhere, they described it as Kara finding stability. If Lucy had been fought over, they described it as honoring her preference. The upcoming fight was no longer only about where the girls lived. It was also about who got to define what had already happened. My attorney told me not to respond emotionally. By then, she no longer had to say it twice. The case needed evidence, not outrage. The problem was that evidence could be quiet while fear was loud. I was already tired. Not the collapsing kind of tired I had been a month earlier, when I tried to handle everything myself. The new system was better. My work schedule was steadier. Transportation no longer depended entirely on me. The bathroom changes had reduced daily friction. Kara was back in the pool. Lucy had stopped asking whether she was allowed to take food from the pantry, but stable did not mean effortless. There were still mornings when one small problem set off 3 others. A dead car battery delayed school. A change in Kara's swim schedule forced me to reorganize a work meeting. Lucy forgot a project at home and cried in the parking lot because she was convinced one mistake would ruin everything. I had stopped pretending competent adults never became overwhelmed. That made Scott's attack more dangerous, not less. He was going to use the truth. Before that happened, Monica tried something softer. The proposal came through the lawyers instead of directly, which somehow made it worse. She offered to stop challenging Kara's continued placement with me. In exchange, Lucy would return to Monica as her primary home, with appropriate time to Scott. The words were dressed in settlement language. Reducing conflict, respecting each child's needs, giving Kara continuity, restoring Lucy's bond with her mother. The first time my attorney explained it, I did not immediately answer. That scared me, because for one exhausted second, I understood the appeal. If Lucy returned to Monica, there would be one fewer school schedule on my refrigerator, one fewer teenager needing rides, clothes, permission forms, dentist appointments, and emotional attention. My grocery bill would shrink. My legal position might become easier because Monica would stop fighting me over Kara. Scott would still object, but even his claim would be narrower. My house would become quieter. Kara's accessibility needs were already being addressed. Lucy was the child both parents wanted. There was a version of the story where agreeing to Monica's proposal could be described as compromise. A practical solution, a way to reduce conflict. I sat at my desk after the call and stared at the yellow sticky notes around my monitor until the shape of the offer became impossible to miss. One child for each house. Monica kept Lucy. I kept Kara. The language had changed, but the solution had not. I thought of Lucy in court saying, "They both picked me, nobody picked her." If I accepted, I would still be separating the girls, because it made adult life easier. I called my attorney back. I told her no. I did not give her a speech to repeat. I did not want Monica told that I was taking some grand moral stand. I simply would not agree to a settlement built around dividing the sisters against the wishes they had consistently expressed. That decision cost me. A few days later, Scott attacked the part of my case I was least comfortable defending, whether I could sustain this life long term. He pointed to facts: my age, full-time job, finite savings, a house that had required modifications, and the demands of raising 2 teenagers. There was enough truth in the argument to make my stomach tighten. Months earlier, I might have answered by pretending I needed no help. Instead, my attorney and I documented what actually existed. An annual salary of about $2,000, a manageable mortgage, roughly $28,000 in emergency savings before the crisis, the real cost of the accessibility work, a revised work schedule, backup transportation, the girls' existing health coverage, and their parents' continuing financial obligations. It was not a heroic picture. It was a workable one. Joan found me printing the summaries and looked at the stack in my arms. Clearly, you're down to only 4 binders. I had 3. I did not correct her because that would have proved her point. The humor helped, but not enough to keep the case out of the house. That was my next mistake. I had tried to keep legal paperwork contained to my bedroom or my work bag, but one evening I was on a call with my attorney at the dining table because Lucy was using my bedroom desk for a school project, and Kara was supposed to be at swimming. Swimming had ended early. I did not hear Kara come in through the side entrance. My attorney was summarizing Scott's position about my finances and long-term capacity. She used the phrase Kara's care requirements while explaining how the filing characterized the strain on my household. By the time I noticed Kara in the hallway, the call was almost over. She did not interrupt. Her face did not change dramatically. She just looked toward the stack of papers, then toward me. I ended the call as quickly as I could without making the moment stranger. Kara told me swimming had been shortened because of a pool issue. I nodded. She rolled toward her room. That was all. I knew better than to chase her with reassurance. I also knew silence could grow teeth if left alone too long. At dinner, Kara barely ate. Lucy noticed. So did I. I asked once whether Kara wanted to talk. She said she was tired. I let that answer stand for the evening. The next afternoon, I came home to voices coming from the living room. Not loud at first. Lucy was upset. Kara sounded controlled. I stopped just inside the doorway because neither had noticed me yet. Kara was telling Lucy that maybe things would be simpler if she moved somewhere else for a while. She said the case would be easier if the court did not have to evaluate whether I could handle both of them. Lucy could stay. Kara could go somewhere already set up for wheelchair users. They would still see each other. Every sentence was calm. That frightened me more than shouting. Kara had turned self-erasure into a plan again. Lucy did not respond calmly. Stop leaving me before they can. Her voice cracked on the last word. Kara looked as if Lucy had slapped her. Lucy was standing beside the couch, with both fists pressed into the sides of her sweatpants. She had spent months watching Kara volunteer to disappear so nobody else would have to feel guilty. Lucy had watched Kara offer to disappear more than once, and she was no longer hearing sacrifice. She was hearing another person, preparing to leave her. Kara tried to explain that she was protecting her. Lucy shook her head hard enough to send hair across her face. She said she did not need Kara deciding what was best for her the way their parents had. That stopped Kara. I stepped farther into the room then, not because I wanted to referee the argument, but because the two of them had reached a place where the adult's damage was speaking through both girls. Lucy saw me first. Her face tightened. For 1 second, I expected her to run to her room, but she stayed exactly where she was. Kara turned her chair toward me, but would not look directly at my face. I sat down on the arm of the chair nearest me. I did not tell Kara she had misunderstood Scott's filing. She had not. Her care had been described as a financial and logistical strain. The distortion came from what that fact was supposed to mean. I told them only that the court case was my responsibility and the lawyer's responsibility, not theirs. Neither girl needed to make herself smaller to improve my chances. Kara's jaw tightened. She said something about reality. I knew what she meant. Reality was money, schedules, age, work, and accessibility, the same things Scott had named. But another reality was sitting in front of us. Lucy did not want to lose her sister, and Kara's attempt to protect her was hurting her too. I did not force an apology. That had never helped. Lucy eventually went to her room. Kara stayed in the living room. The television remained off. I sat with her for a while without talking. 10 minutes later, she asked whether the court could make her live somewhere she did not want. I gave her the only answer I trusted myself to give. Her wishes mattered, but they were not the only factor. She had her own lawyer for exactly that reason. She could tell Marisol what she wanted, even if what she wanted frightened me. Kara looked at me then. I think she had expected me to tell her what answer would protect the case. I did not. That night, Lucy came into the kitchen after Kara had gone to bed. She was supposed to be brushing her teeth. Instead, she sat at the table wearing mismatched socks and stared at a spot near my coffee maker. She had been quiet since the argument. I poured myself water and waited. Lucy finally said she understood why everyone worried more about Kara. The sentence sounded rehearsed, as if she had told herself the same thing many times. Kara had medical appointments, accessible places to think about, and transportation that required planning. Lucy could walk into almost any building, sleep in almost any room, and ride in almost any car. At first, being the child both parents planned around had felt good. Then she began trying not to complain, forget things, get sick, need money, or make teachers call home. They wanted me because I was easy. Her voice grew smaller. What happens if I stop being easy? That was the fear underneath being chosen. Kara believed needing too much made people leave. Lucy had begun to believe needing less was why they stayed. Then she looked at me. If I ever get hard, do I become Kara? I did not answer with a promise that nobody would ever leave her. I told her that in my house, bad grades, illness, anger, mistakes, expensive problems, and bad days could bring consequences or require changes, but they would not change whether she belonged there. She listened without looking convinced. I had months, maybe years, to prove it. A few days later, both girls' lawyers confirmed the next stage of the case. The court wanted updated child-focused information before the contested hearing moved forward. Kara would speak separately with Marisol. Lucy would speak separately with Priya. Their wishes, their experiences, and their sense of what arrangement felt safe and stable would be presented through the proper process. Neither girl would be asked to choose which adult deserved to win, but they would be asked what they actually wanted. That should have reassured me. Instead, I thought about Kara in the living room, telling Lucy she might ask to leave. I had spent months fighting to keep the sisters together. Now, for the first time, I had to accept something harder than any filing Monica or Scott could submit. Kara had her own voice, and if she told Marisol she wanted to go somewhere else, I had no right to silence it, just because I was afraid of what the truth might do to my case. The hardest thing I did after Kara said she might ask to leave was refuse to prepare either girl for the answer I wanted. I did not review the school email with Kara, remind her what Monica and Scott had said, or tell Lucy that staying together strengthened my case. I wanted the court to keep them with me desperately, which meant I had become exactly the kind of adult who had to be careful around children whose words could change what happened next. The reminder came the morning Kara was scheduled to meet Marisol. She had been quieter than usual while getting ready for school, not withdrawn exactly, more like someone rehearsing a conversation without moving her lips. I drove both girls in because Kara's appointment with Marisol would happen after classes. Lucy had her own meeting with Priya later in the week. Halfway there, Kara asked what she was supposed to say if she wanted to help me. The question tightened every muscle in my shoulders. Lucy stopped looking out the window. For months, both girls had been taught that every answer belonged to someone: a mother, a father, a lawyer, a side. Now Kara was offering her answer to me. I kept my eyes on the road. "Tell Marisol what you actually want," I said. "Let the adults deal with the consequences." Kara did not answer right away. I could feel her watching the side of my face. She had probably expected something more useful. A list. A reassurance. A reminder that the court needed stability. Maybe even an instruction disguised as concern. I gave her none of it. When we reached school, she opened the door, transferred into her chair, and adjusted her backpack before looking back through the window. There was uncertainty in her face, but there was also something else. Space. This time, I had left that space unfilled. That afternoon, after her meeting with Marisol, Kara came home tired in a way that had nothing to do with swimming or school. I did not ask what she had said. That was another form of doing nothing. She went to her room, shut the door, and stayed there until dinner. Lucy noticed. She kept glancing toward the hallway as though Kara might return with an official result taped to her forehead. I put food on the table and talked about school instead. Nobody believed I was genuinely interested in the community college parking committee meeting I had attended that morning, but it gave us something harmless to dislike together. Kara eventually came out. She ate. She complained about the rice being too dry. I accepted the complaint as evidence that the world had not ended. Later that night, after Lucy went to bed, Kara found me in the living room folding towels. She told me she had said some things to Marisol that might hurt my case. I put the towel down. My chest reacted before my face did. The fear was immediate. Had she said she wanted another placement? Had she said the house was too hard? Had she told Marisol I was overwhelmed? I wanted answers. Instead, I asked whether what she had said was true. Kara nodded. That was all I needed to know. I told her then it belonged in the case. She stared at me for a long moment, before rolling closer to the couch. The conversation that followed was not one clean confession. Kara did not suddenly explain 6 years of fear in a perfectly organized speech. She gave me pieces. Some came that night. Some came later. What she finally let me understand was that her belief about being a burden had begun long before Monica and Scott divorced. It started after the crash. She remembered Monica sleeping in hospital chairs, Scott fighting with insurance companies, appointments being moved, meals eaten from containers, and every adult learning new routines because a 9-year-old's body had changed in a second. She had been young enough to need everybody, and old enough to notice what needing everybody did to them. Life improved after rehabilitation, but the extra planning remained. Buildings had to be checked, equipment remembered, cars loaded, trips adjusted. Nobody ever sat Kara down and told her she had ruined their lives. She learned from sighs, looks exchanged when a restaurant had steps, and arguments over forgotten equipment. By the time her parents' marriage began collapsing, she already had a private strategy. Ask less, offer to stay home, make the joke first, leave before somebody had to tell her she had become too much. I kept thinking there was a point where people ran out, she said. I knew she meant patience and energy as much as love. The youth program email made sense in a way I had not wanted it to. Kara had been trying to leave while people still cared enough to miss her. I could not promise that nobody would ever disappoint or leave her, so I told her only that she did not have to leave my house before I had asked her to. Then I went back to folding towels. Kara stayed in the room. Lucy's meeting with Priya happened 3 days later. Her anxiety looked different. Kara got quieter when she felt trapped. Lucy became helpful. That morning, she loaded the dishwasher without being asked, straightened cushions nobody cared about, and reminded me twice about a form I had already signed. I finally took the dish towel out of her hands. She looked offended. I told her the plates could survive without her. She did not laugh. I knew better than to ask what she planned to tell Priya. Still, after school she came home with the same hollowed-out look Kara had carried. For several hours, the sisters avoided each other. That tension finally broke over something that had nothing to do with lawyers. Lucy had plans with a friend that weekend. She wanted to go to a school event afterward. Kara made a comment about transportation. Lucy interpreted it as Kara, questioning whether she should go. Kara interpreted Lucy's reaction as proof she was still blaming her for everything. Within minutes, they were standing in the kitchen dragging months of resentment into an argument about one Saturday afternoon. I almost stepped in. Then I heard Lucy say something I had never heard her say aloud. She admitted there had been times she hated how much family life revolved around Kara. The words stopped the room. Lucy looked horrified the second they were out. Her face folded in on itself. She explained in a rush that she had hated appointments sometimes. She hated waiting. She hated when trips changed. She hated adults asking how Kara was doing before asking about her. She had even wished, on bad days, that 1 week could pass without anything involving accessibility or schedules. Then the crash came into her face. Not the old car crash, but the realization of what she believed those thoughts made her. She started crying. Not loudly. Tears simply rolled down her face while she stood beside the counter. She said maybe that was why their parents had chosen her. Maybe she had secretly wanted life to be easier, and somehow that had made it happen at Kara's expense. Kara stared at her. For a long moment, I worried the cruelty of the situation had finally found a way to wedge itself permanently between them. Then Kara spoke. Being annoyed with me didn't make them abandon me. Lucy looked up. Kara's voice remained rough but steady. She told Lucy she had been annoying too. Lucy left clothes everywhere, took too long in the bathroom, sang the same 4 lines of songs until everybody wanted to walk into traffic. Lucy made a wet, offended noise through her tears. Kara kept going. The point was not that sisters never made life harder for each other. They did. Lucy had not made Monica or Scott abandon Kara. Those choices belonged to the adults who made them. They did not hug. Lucy wiped her face with her sleeve. Kara told her that was disgusting, and Lucy told Kara to mind her own business. The argument loosened into something almost normal. They did not hug. That would have been too neat. Lucy wiped her face with her sleeve. Kara told her that was disgusting. Lucy told Kara to mind her own business. Normality returned by insult. Over the next few days, the girls began talking differently about what staying together actually meant. Until then, "Don't separate us" had functioned almost like a survival oath. They had resisted their parents' choosing game by clinging to the idea that sisters had to remain a unit. But living together safely could not mean becoming one person. Kara wanted more independence. She did not want me, or Lucy, automatically volunteering to help with tasks she could do herself. She wanted to handle more of her school transportation planning and wanted everyone to stop treating adaptive swimming like a family ceremony. Lucy wanted the freedom to spend time with friends without feeling she was abandoning Kara. She wanted activities that did not require checking whether her sister could participate. At first, she looked guilty admitting it. Kara rolled her eyes. She told Lucy she had absolutely no desire to attend every middle school event in Sacramento just to prove they loved each other. That got a laugh. They also agreed on what they did not want. They did not want to be asked to prove loyalty to one parent by criticizing the other. They did not want individual activities turned into evidence of which household they preferred. They did not want adults using one sister's needs to decide the other sister's future. They wanted the same home. They did not want the same life. That distinction mattered more than I understood at first. The first practical test came 2 nights later. I discovered they had both changed the password to one of the streaming accounts. Apparently, Kara had done it because Lucy kept creating ridiculous profiles. Lucy claimed Kara had no right because she did not pay for the account. Kara pointed out that neither did Lucy. The argument lasted long enough for me to learn that both girls considered access to a mediocre crime series a constitutional right. I stood in the hallway listening to them fight about the password and nearly smiled. A few months earlier, every argument between them carried the possibility of separation underneath it. Now Lucy was threatening to delete Kara's profile picture. Kara was threatening to rename Lucy's account. Gremlin. No one was choosing a parent. No one was choosing a house. They were just sisters being ridiculous. I eventually told them if they could not solve it, I would change the password myself and keep it. The argument ended immediately. That might have been the most effective exercise of authority I managed all year. While the household became easier to recognize as a home, the legal case became more focused. Marisol represented Kara's interests, and Priya represented Lucy's, so neither girl had to speak through the other. Their accounts were not identical, which made the overlap more credible. Both remembered the family meeting. Both remembered refusing to choose. Both described the shift that followed, and both wanted to remain in the same home without pretending my house was perfect. By winter, my attorney no longer needed one dramatic piece of proof. The record had become a pattern built from sources already planted in the case, my own messages, the girls' communications preserved through their lawyers, the Fuller Monica Scott threads, obtained after Scott's selective filing, school and transportation records, prior declarations, and the first-hand accounts Ethan and Dana had formally provided. Each source covered a different part of the same history. The remaining question was what the court would do with it. Monica came to my house on a rainy evening in January. Sacramento rain was nothing like the storms people imagine when they think of winter. No snowdrifts. No dramatic white landscape. Just cold water running off the gutters and a gray sky that made 5 in the afternoon feel much later. She asked to speak with me alone. The girls were both home, so I did not invite her farther than the kitchen. Kara was working in her room. Lucy had headphones on in the living room, though I suspected the volume was lower than she wanted me to believe. Monica looked exhausted. Not courtroom exhausted. Not angry. She had lost weight. The engagement ring was still on her finger, but she kept turning it as she spoke. Ethan had not ended things, not yet, but the relationship had changed. He was asking questions she did not want to answer. His son had apparently noticed tension in the household. Family members who once accepted Monica's explanation about Kara were becoming less willing to repeat it. Monica said the custody case was destroying her future. Ethan no longer trusted her. Family members were looking at her differently, and every filing seemed to widen the distance between her and the girls. Then she asked me to withdraw my claim so the family could heal privately. Months earlier, that word might have worked on me. I had spent my life believing family problems should stay inside the family, but privacy had protected the adults far better than it had protected Kara or Lucy. Monica had named what the case was costing her without naming what the girls had already lost. I told her I would not withdraw. I told Monica I would not withdraw. There was no speech after that. Nothing I could say would improve the truth. Her hand stopped turning the ring. She stared at me long enough that I could see the old relationship between us sitting underneath everything else. My little sister. The woman I had once protected. The mother I had watched learn how to transfer Kara safely after the crash. The person who could remember Kara's preferred socks while still arranging a future without her. For a moment, I grieved someone who was standing 6 feet away from me. Monica picked up her purse. Before leaving, she stopped beside the kitchen doorway. Her face had hardened again. Then don't pretend Kara hasn't told people how exhausted you are. The front door closed behind her. I stood in the kitchen listening to the rain tap against the window. She was right about one thing. Kara had told the truth. I had been exhausted. I had tried to do too much. I had made mistakes. There were days when the house overwhelmed me. Days when I had wanted 10 minutes without a school email, a legal message, a transportation problem, or somebody calling my name from another room. Kara knew all of that. So did Lucy. So did their lawyers. And now the court probably would too. Months earlier, that thought would have terrified me enough to start editing myself. I would have wanted Kara to explain the exhaustion differently. I would have wanted everyone to know how willingly I carried it. I would have tried to turn my house into evidence that love made everything easy. Standing there in the January rain, I finally understood why that would have been another lie. My case could not depend on perfection, neither could our family. If the truth was not enough to keep the girls safe, then whatever I won by hiding it, would not be safety at all. By the time the final contested hearing began, I no longer expected one perfect document to explain everything. What we had instead was a record built from ordinary pieces, messages, school notes, fuller text threads, declarations, and first-hand accounts, each created before anyone knew how they would look beside the others. The hearing was in February, almost 6 months after the day Kara had looked at me in that same courthouse and asked where she was supposed to go. The season had changed. Sacramento mornings were cooler, gray enough that I needed a jacket walking from the parking garage. The heat that had shimmered over the courthouse steps in August felt like something from another life. So did the woman I had been then. I had stood up in that courtroom without knowing the first thing about becoming a non-parent custodian. I had assumed wanting to protect the girls was the hard part. It was not. The hard part was protecting them without turning them into evidence every time they had a bad day. The hard part was letting Kara tell the truth about my exhaustion. The hard part was letting Lucy admit she had liked being chosen. The hard part was learning that a stable home did not mean a silent home, a grateful home, or a home where nobody ever complained. That morning, the girls were not seated beside me in the same way they had been at the first hearing. Their attorneys handled their participation carefully. Marisol represented Kara. Priya represented Lucy. Neither girl had to sit through every adult accusation, as if enduring pain proved maturity. I was grateful for that. I had learned enough about courts to stop wanting dramatic moments. Drama had already done enough damage. The legal question before the judge was narrower than the emotional one. The court was not deciding which adult loved Kara and Lucy more. It was not deciding whether Monica was a bad person or Scott was selfish. It was deciding whether returning the girls to either parent under the pattern already established would be detrimental to them, and whether keeping them in my custody was necessary for their best interests. That distinction mattered because love was something everybody claimed. Behavior was easier to examine. Scott's side went first against me. I knew what was coming. His filings had been consistent for weeks. I was 56, worked full-time, had modified my house after Kara arrived, used savings, and admitted that the first months exhausted me. None of that was false. When it was my turn to answer questions, I explained what had changed. My work schedule was more predictable. Kara had helped decide which accessibility changes actually mattered. Transportation no longer depended on one person, and the girls' school and medical routines had stabilized. My home was not sustained by pretending nothing was hard. It was sustained by planning. Scott's attorney asked about the night Kara overheard that her care was being discussed as a strain. I did not pretend it had not happened. I said Kara had heard the truth. I had been tired. The question then became whether being tired made me incapable of caring for her. I looked toward the judge rather than Scott. No, I said. It meant I had to build a better system. That was all. I had no interest in pretending fatigue was shameful. Scott needed my use of support to look like incapacity, even though his own parenting had always depended on schools, insurance, transportation, Monica, Dana, and me. The records were already showing the real difference. What happened to Kara when adult support became inconvenient? When Monica's side presented her version of the history, I understood why she had always been the harder person for me to confront. Scott minimized. Monica refined. She did not deny that Kara had spent more and more time with me before the first hearing. She explained it. She did not deny asking me to keep Kara longer. She contextualized it. She did not deny discussing separate residences for the sisters. She described it as an attempt to reduce transitions and let each child have stability. Every answer was shaped to preserve one idea. She had never rejected Kara. She had only been trying to solve a difficult situation. I watched her sitting across the room with her hands folded over a legal pad. Monica did not look monstrous sitting across the room with her hands folded over a legal pad. She looked like a woman trying to convince the court that all the moments where Kara had been excluded meant something gentler when viewed separately. Then the documents began closing around her. The first was the message she had sent me weeks before the August hearing. "Can you keep Kara until Scott figures out what he's doing? Don't tell her it might be longer." Monica explained that message by saying she had been trying to prevent Kara from feeling uncertain while the adults worked out a temporary schedule. That interpretation might have survived by itself. Then came the declaration. Kara expressed a preference to remain with Elaine because Elaine's quieter household is better suited to her emotional needs. Kara had denied ever making that choice. Her account to Marisol had been consistent. So had the earlier complaint that Monica had transformed into preference. Kara was tired of hauling equipment and belongings between homes. Then came Ethan. His testimony was brief. That made it stronger. He did not say Monica was abusive. He did not say she was a terrible mother. He said only what he personally knew. When he and Monica had discussed a future household, he had raised accessibility himself. He had been willing to consider a single-story home or modifications. Monica told him that Kara had already chosen to live elsewhere. He believed her. That was all. The sentence carried more weight than an accusation would have. Monica had spent months implying that her future household created practical limitations. The man she was building that household with had just testified that he had offered to include Kara in the planning. Monica had removed her from the plan first. The next contradiction came from Monica's later proposal to me. She had offered to take Lucy back immediately while Kara stayed with me. At the time, she had described it as reducing pressure on my household. In court, that wording sounded different beside everything else. No single line proved intent. What mattered was the direction the choices kept moving. When care became difficult, Kara stayed somewhere else. When family life was imagined, Lucy was invited. When the result needed a kinder explanation, Kara was said to have preferred it. Scott's case came apart differently. He had always believed Monica's failures would protect him. From the beginning, he had tried to position himself as the more practical parent, less emotional, more honest about limitations. Months earlier, his attorney had filed selected text exchanges to show how often Monica canceled or shifted responsibility. Those messages had looked damaging to Monica when viewed alone. The complete relevant threads were less generous. The fuller threads showed the handoff repeating. Monica would say she could not take Kara. Scott would say he had plans or was unavailable, and one of them would eventually contact me. Scott had introduced the messages to expose Monica, but the complete context showed that responsibility often passed through him instead of stopping there. Scott's attorney tried to focus on Monica being the initiating parent in several exchanges. Technically, that was sometimes true. It did not help him, because the issue was not who passed the responsibility first. It was who accepted it. Scott repeatedly did not. The school transportation record from spring made that impossible to dismiss as litigation behavior. Third occasion this month, neither parent has confirmed responsibility for Kara's pickup. That was before the July filings. Before my formal custody claim. Before anyone could plausibly say Scott had stepped back because I was interfering. I remembered the afternoon described in that record. Kara waiting near the school office, her backpack across her lap. The irritation in her face. Me rushing from work because two parents had each assumed the other one would become responsible eventually. At the time, Scott later told me Monica misunderstood the schedule. Monica told me Scott had failed to communicate. The school record did not care which excuse was better. Kara had still been waiting. Dana's testimony was narrow too. She explained that when Scott had discussed a weekend trip, she suggested an accessible rental so both girls could go. Scott had dismissed the idea. He told her Kara disliked traveling. The question was not whether one vacation mattered enough to decide custody. It did not. The problem was that Kara had never been asked. That detail fit too neatly beside the others. Scott assumed what Kara wanted when the assumption made his life easier. Each event could be defended separately, but repeated avoidance had become a choice whether he named it or not. The girls' voices entered through the process their attorneys had protected. Lucy's August statement remained part of the history, and her later account stayed consistent on the core facts. The parents proposed one child per household. The sisters refused. And afterward, Lucy received more promises, while Kara was discussed in terms of care arrangements. Lucy also admitted that being chosen had made her afraid to become difficult. Kara's account was different and just as useful because she did not pretend my house had been easy. She knew I had been tired. The house required work, and I had made mistakes. She had even considered leaving because she thought my life would become easier without her. What she emphasized through Marisol was simple. I kept trying to solve the problems without deciding one of the girls should disappear. I looked down at the torn skin around my thumbnail. For almost 6 months, I had feared that admitting imperfection would weaken me. Kara's honesty did the opposite. The judge's questions moved through the practical record. The existing order, the months of stability in my home, the girls' schools and activities, contact with each parent, my budget and support structure, and the parents' current proposals. The more ordinary the questions became, the harder one fact was to avoid. Neither Monica nor Scott was offering a stable return for both sisters as a unit. Their plan still treated Lucy as the child to bring back first, and Kara as a separate transition. Near the end of the day, there was a recess while the attorneys discussed whether any agreement remained possible before the court ruled. I sat alone for part of it. My attorney had stepped into the hallway. Joan had offered to come that morning and sit behind me, but I told her no. Not because I did not want support, because I had finally learned support did not require turning every hard day into an audience. I could call her later. When my attorney returned, she had the expression I had begun to recognize. Someone had proposed something. Monica was willing to stop fighting Kara's placement with me. Lucy would return primarily to Monica. Scott would receive expanded time with her. Kara could stay with me under a long-term arrangement. The attorneys described it in more detail, but I stopped listening after the basic structure. The structure of the settlement was familiar before my attorney finished explaining it. Kara stayed with me. Lucy returned primarily to Monica. Scott received expanded time. The temptation was real because the legal fight would shrink and my life would become easier. That last thought made the answer clear. I told my attorney I would not agree to split the sisters against the consistent wishes they had expressed, and I would not trade one child to secure the other. The proposal died there. When court resumed, nobody mentioned it dramatically. The judge knew settlement had failed. The hearing moved into its final stage. Monica looked exhausted. Scott looked angry. Seeing either one like that did not make me feel triumphant. Consequences sound satisfying when they belong to strangers. When they belong to people you once loved, satisfaction becomes complicated. Monica was still my sister. Scott was still the father of the girls sitting somewhere else in the courthouse, with adults assigned to protect them from this exact room. There was no version of the outcome where everybody walked away whole. That had stopped being possible long before I entered the case. My attorney's final argument returned to the pattern rather than any single ugly moment. After the divorce, both parents increasingly shifted Kara's care away. When the girls refused to divide themselves, both parents planned more freely around Lucy. Kara's frustration with constant transitions became a supposed preference to live elsewhere, and when my home became stable enough to threaten the temporary arrangement, both parents renewed claims to Lucy first. Scott's side was right about one principle. A parent should not lose custody simply because a non-parent can offer a stable home. The question was whether returning the girls to the demonstrated pattern would harm them. Monica asked for room to repair the family, but her explanation still treated rejection as Kara's preference, while Scott still described avoidance as practicality. Their current proposals had not escaped the same ranking that started the case. By late afternoon, the light outside the courtroom windows had faded into gray. My back hurt. I had gone through an entire bottle of water without remembering drinking it. The judge looked over the documents one last time, then back toward the attorneys. The room became quieter. I thought of August, Kara's fingers moving over the wheel rim, Lucy twisting her shirt. My own voice asking the court not to separate them before I had any idea what saying yes would cost. I thought of burnt toast, the moon landing bathroom plan, the meatloaf Lucy considered illegal, Kara in the pool threatening to splash us, Lucy standing in my kitchen terrified that a slammed cabinet might make her homeless. All the moments no legal filing could fully contain. The judge began by stating that the court was not there to punish Monica or Scott for being imperfect parents. My heart beat harder anyway. Then the judge turned to the question that had been sitting underneath every hearing since August: whether returning Kara and Lucy to either parent's physical custody, under the conditions shown in the record, would recreate the instability and emotional harm the court had spent months examining. The judge looked down at the findings, then back up. The court is prepared to rule. The judge did not make us wait until another day. After nearly 6 months of temporary orders, evaluations, filings, school records, interviews, and arguments about what each adult had meant, the ruling came down, in the same room where everything had first cracked open. I remember staring at the edge of the table while the judge began reviewing the findings. The wood had a small nick near one corner. I had noticed it during the morning and spent half the afternoon looking at it whenever I needed somewhere to put my eyes. The ruling did not begin with Monica. It did not begin with Scott. It began with Kara and Lucy. The court had considered the girls' current stability, their independent accounts, the history of the shared custody arrangement after the divorce, the repeated failures around transportation and responsibility, the proposals to separate the sisters, and the way both parents continued to approach the girls differently, even after months of litigation. The judge also addressed me, my age, my job, my finances, the fact that my home had not been fully accessible when Kara first arrived, my early exhaustion, the support systems I had eventually put in place. None of those things were ignored. That mattered to me. I had spent enough time around this case to know that a decision built on pretending I was perfect would be fragile. The court did not find me perfect. It found the arrangement stable. Then came the part that changed our lives. Returning Kara and Lucy to either parent's physical custody under the pattern established in the record would, the court found, recreate the instability and emotional harm the girls had already experienced. Their best interests required continuity in the home, where both of them had been living together, and where their daily needs were being met, without forcing one sister to disappear from the other's life. Long-term legal and physical custody was awarded to me as the non-parent custodian. For several seconds, I did not move. I had imagined that moment too many times. In some versions, I cried. In others, I felt triumphant. Once, during a particularly bad week, I imagined turning around and looking Monica straight in the face so she would know she had lost. None of that happened. I sat with both hands flat against my knees because they had begun shaking. Across the room, Monica closed her eyes. Scott stared straight ahead. The word that came to me was not victory, it was weight. Not the crushing weight Kara had spent years believing she placed on other people. Something different. The weight of knowing that 2 children would wake up tomorrow, and the day after that expecting my house to remain their house. That was not a prize. It was responsibility. The judge continued. Monica and Scott did not regain physical custody. Their parental rights remained intact. Contact would continue under a structured arrangement based on the girls' welfare, and they remained financially responsible for support and health coverage. If either parent later wanted the custody order changed, the proper process remained open, but the girls' stability would no longer depend on whichever parent had the more persuasive explanation that week. For months, Kara and Lucy had lived inside adult intentions, what mom meant, what dad intended, what somebody supposedly believed Kara preferred. The order rested on what had actually happened. When the hearing ended, there was no applause. The clerk gathered papers. Lawyers began discussing copies of orders and next procedural steps. The room returned to being a room. I stood slowly because my legs felt numb. Kara and Lucy had not been forced to sit through the full hearing, but their attorneys brought them back once the decision had been explained in an age-appropriate way. Lucy came through the doorway first. Her eyes searched the room before they found me. Kara was beside her. I did not know what expression was on my face, but Lucy must have understood enough. She walked toward me, then stopped. That hesitation told me more about the last year than any court record. She was still waiting to see what kind of news this was. Not legally. Emotionally. Would someone be celebrating while someone else was losing? Would she be expected to pick a reaction? Would being relieved mean she had betrayed her mother? I had learned enough not to force the moment. I told them only that they were staying together and coming home with me. Lucy's shoulders dropped. Kara looked down at the floor. Her hand touched the wheel rim once, then went still. Neither girl cried. That almost made me cry. On the way out, Monica stood near the hallway with her attorney. For one terrible second, Lucy slowed. I saw the old reflex return. The part of her that scanned adults for the answer they wanted. Monica looked at both girls. Her face had none of the careful polish she usually carried into court. She looked tired, older. She told them she loved them. I believed her. That was the difficult truth I carried out of the courthouse. Monica loved her daughters, and Scott probably did too. But love had spent too long separated from responsibility. Kara nodded at Monica. Lucy gave her a small hug. Scott stayed farther back and told the girls he would see them under the new schedule. Kara thanked him with such formality that he flinched. A few months earlier, I might have enjoyed that. By February, the damage was too visible for revenge to feel satisfying. The parking garage smelled like concrete and exhaust. Rain from the previous night had left dark patches near the entrance. When I unlocked the car, Lucy automatically opened the rear door. Kara began transferring without waiting for me. I loaded her chair the way I had done dozens of times by then. No ceremony. Halfway home, Lucy asked if we could get fries. Kara immediately said fries were not a legally recognized emotional support service. Lucy argued that the court had failed to consider several important facts. I told them I had just spent all day listening to legal arguments and would not tolerate any more from the back seat. We got fries. That was the first thing we did after I received custody of 2 children. Not paperwork. Not a speech about family. French fries eaten in a parked car because nobody had remembered lunch properly. It felt right. The legal ruling did not fix what happened outside the courthouse. Consequences unfolded more slowly there. Ethan ended his engagement to Monica about 3 weeks later. He sent me one brief message afterward. Not to cast himself as the good man in the story, but to say he would no longer be part of future household planning involving the girls. He had been willing to discuss a home that included Kara. Monica had told him she had already chosen elsewhere. Once he understood that she had used a decision he never demanded to justify Kara's absence, he could no longer trust the future they had been building. The breakup did not create a public collapse around Monica. She kept her job, went on with her life, and continued seeing the girls under the order. The consequence was closer to home. Ethan left, relatives stopped repeating her version automatically, and the girls stopped organizing every good thing in their lives around preserving her approval. Scott's consequence developed more quietly. Dana did not leave him at once. She simply stopped agreeing with the story he told about the case. When he described the problem as ordinary scheduling blown out of proportion or claimed I had taken control, she no longer reinforced it. Over time, their relationship cooled. Scott also received some of the freedom he had wanted after the divorce. Fewer school mornings, fewer transportation problems, fewer accessibility decisions. The cost appeared in the same ordinary places. The girls still had scheduled time with him, but their routines increasingly began and ended at my house, and some news reached him through calendars instead of excited phone calls. I saw the change one Saturday after a visit. Lucy came through my door talking too fast about a spilled drink at a restaurant. Kara rolled in behind her, and within seconds they were arguing about a shoe left in the wrong place. The visit with their father had happened without determining the emotional temperature of the rest of the evening. I closed the door and let home be home. Kara's change came in smaller increments. The first time I noticed the difference clearly, she was trying to get through a doorway at school after some equipment had been moved during maintenance. The clearance that had worked before no longer did. Months earlier, she might have angled around it for days, or decided a room was not worth entering, or told herself it was temporary because fixing it would inconvenience someone. Instead, she came home irritated, not ashamed. I was in the kitchen sorting mail when she rolled in and dropped her backpack onto the table. "I need this fixed." The sentence was so ordinary that I almost missed what it meant. Kara explained the blocked doorway, and I immediately started over-planning measurements, facilities calls, and school contacts until she raised a hand. "One solution, Aunt Elaine. Not a federal infrastructure bill." I laughed. We contacted the school, and the obstruction was corrected. The important change was not the doorway. Kara had needed something, and asked for it without first making herself cheaper to keep. She still apologized sometimes, but less automatically. She told me when a bathroom setup did not work, and asked for help loading the chair on days her shoulder hurt. That last one I could have done without. Lucy's test came through something much smaller than custody. A bad grade. She had been doing well at school, partly because she treated every assignment like a referendum on whether adults should keep loving her. Then she bombed a math test. She hid it for a day. I found out because the school portal notified me. When Lucy came home, she already knew I knew. I could tell from the way she placed her backpack carefully beside the chair instead of dropping it in the usual pile. She sat at the kitchen table before I asked. Her fingers twisted together. Months earlier, I might have rushed to reassure Lucy that one bad grade meant nothing. Instead, we dealt with what actually happened. She had been confused, felt embarrassed, and tried to fix it before I noticed. We made a study plan, and I grounded her from her phone for the weekend, because hiding the problem was still a problem. Lucy stared at me before asking, "So, I'm still allowed to live here while grounded?" I laughed before I could stop myself, and a second later she did too. She still had to fix the math. She was still grounded. She also still lived there. By Saturday, she was complaining loudly enough about losing her phone that the consequence had become wonderfully ordinary. Months passed. The legal folders moved from my dining table to a cabinet. Not the trash. I had learned too much about documentation to become reckless. But the papers stopped controlling the room. The ramp gained scuff marks from everyday use. Kara complained that Lucy kept leaving shoes too close to the path inside the door. Lucy insisted Kara exaggerated. Kara proved her point one morning by rolling directly over one sneaker. I made her apologize. She argued that physics had made the decision. I remained unmoved. The refrigerator became covered with schedules, school reminders, swim times, work notes, and one ridiculous drawing Kara made of me holding 3 calendars while standing under a sign labeled Control Tower. Joan saw it when she came over for coffee and said the artist had captured my essence. I told her she was no longer welcome. She drank the coffee anyway. I stopped staying late at work just to prove I could handle everything without adjusting my life. Joan stopped checking whether I had eaten lunch every day. Not because she stopped caring, because I usually had. Ben visited when his own schedule allowed. He remained my son, not a backup parent I had drafted into service. Monica's contact with the girls continued unevenly. Some visits went well, some left them quiet afterward. Scott sometimes did better, then slipped into old habits of planning around convenience. The court order did not transform either parent. It simply stopped their inconsistency from determining where the girls slept. That turned out to be enough space for the rest of us to grow. One afternoon near the end of the school year, I picked Kara and Lucy up after an activity. The sun was bright again, the Sacramento heat starting to return after the cooler months. Kara transferred into the car while Lucy talked about dinner. She disliked my first suggestion. Kara disliked Lucy's replacement suggestion. Within 30 seconds, they had turned meal planning into a dispute involving noodles, tacos, and whether frozen pizza counted as cooking. I loaded Kara's chair and shut the back. Someone from the activity had followed us into the parking lot and called to Lucy, asking where they were going afterward. Lucy did not hesitate. Home. She climbed into the car. That was it. One word. No one looked at me. No one paused to appreciate it. Kara was already telling Lucy that her dinner choice was terrible. Lucy was telling Kara she had eaten fries for breakfast once, and therefore had no standing to judge anyone. I got behind the wheel. There were scuff marks on the ramp waiting for us. A math worksheet on the kitchen counter. Laundry in a basket I had been avoiding for 2 days. A refrigerator covered in schedules. A 15-year-old who still hated being hovered over. A 12-year-old who had recently discovered that getting grounded did not terminate residency. A 56-year-old aunt who still overplanned when nervous, and occasionally forgot to eat lunch when things got busy. Nothing about us looked like the family I would have imagined a year earlier. Home had stopped being a place where anybody had to win a competition to stay. Difficulty could come through the door without pushing somebody else out. I started the car. Lucy was still arguing about dinner. Kara told her she would rather eat my meatloaf. I turned around so quickly she started laughing before I said a word. Some insults remain unforgivable. Then I pulled out of the parking lot and took my girls home.